The city had cast him out beyond the gates like trash. No weapons, no money, no food except a piece of moldy bread. They left him a rusty two-wheeled cart and a note. Go and don't come back. The guards on the wall look anywhere but at him, and he doesn't even remember how he ended up here. He only remembers the headlights in his face and the impact. Dan opens his eyes and sees the sky. Not the ceiling of the ICU, the sky. Gray and low like the belly of a sick beast. He's lying on his back in the middle of a broken road. Dust has clogged his nostrils. His mouth tastes of iron and smoke. He coughs so hard he rolls onto his side. He sits up. His head is buzzing like a transformer box. To his right is a 12-meter-high stone wall. Figures in chainmail are walking along it. Dan blinks twice. They don't disappear. One looks down at him and turns away. Nearby is a rusty two-axle cart with a bent arch over the bed. In the bed are a shovel and a flask. A scrap of paper on the sack. The letters are angular, like runes, unfamiliar, but he understands them. He just understands. As if he'd always known this language. Go, and don't come back. The city doesn't feed extra mouths. Dan lifts his head. The gates are closed. Guards who look anywhere but at him. He's been cast out. He doesn't know from where. He doesn't know where to. But he's been cast out. And here, habit kicks in before fear. He walks up to the cart and examines it. 2 axles. The rear one is rotten, but holds. The wheels are wooden with iron rims. The left front one wobbles. The frame is solid. Good geometry. Someone, sometime, built this cart right. He opens the sack. The bread is moldy. The inside is still edible if you cut it off. A flask. The water is murky and smells like a swamp. It's drinkable if boiled. Dan looks around. Behind him is a wall and a city that doesn't want him. Ahead, the road leads into a scorched plain. Something is smoking on the horizon. Not a single sound of an engine. Not a single wire. Not a single trace in the sky. He closes his eyes for 3 seconds, opens them. Nothing has changed. He says one word aloud. Fine. He spits into his palm, grabs the shaft, and walks. He walks for half an hour before allowing himself to think. Facts. First, he's dead. A head-on collision with a truck on the oncoming lane. 0 chance of survival. So this isn't a coma. Delirium doesn't smell like manure so convincingly. Second, he's in another world. Walls, chainmail, a language he knows but never studied. Third, he has nothing. No weapons, no money, no combat skills, no magic, no allies. 2 days' worth of food. Fourth, he has a truck. And this is where it gets interesting. In his past life, Dan designed mobile field hospitals out of trucks. He'd take a rusty box on wheels and turn it into something that saved lives. He knows pipes. He knows axles. He knows how to distribute the weight so it doesn't tip over on a turn. This cart is worse than any truck, but it has wheels. And wheels mean movement, and movement means life. By noon, he finds a stream. He strikes a spark with 2 stones. 20 minutes. The dry grass catches fire. In the back, he finds a crumpled helmet that somehow ended up under a sack. He boils water in it. He cuts the mold off the bread. He slices thin pieces with a multi-tool. He dries them on a rock. He eats half. His first meal in the new world. Lousy, but under control. He writes in his notebook. Day 1. Enough bread for a day and a half. Need to find food by tomorrow evening. He puts out the fire, douses it with water, stamps it down. Don't leave a fire behind that will give you away. By evening, the road reaches the ridge. Below is a village, or rather what's left of it. Houses without roofs, walls covered in soot, not a single light, not a single movement, a dead place. There are useful things in dead villages. Nails, ropes, metal. But in dead villages, there's also what made the village dead. He rolls the cart back over the ridge, lies down beneath the bottom of the cart on his jacket. Above him is a foreign sky with so many stars that it's white, not a single familiar constellation. And now the fear comes, not during the day when he was busy, now, in the silence, alone. He clenches the multi-tool in his fist, the only thing from home. The metal is warm from his palm. Tomorrow, the village. Tomorrow, food. He has a tomorrow. That's quite a lot for a dead man. He falls asleep. The morning is gray and cold. Dan wakes up to a sound, a low sound. as if someone were dragging something heavy across the ground. The sound comes from the dead village. Then it fades. He crawls to the ridge and peeks out. On the road leading out of the village stands an overturned wagon that wasn't there yesterday. A horse lies nearby, and two small figures are moving near the wagon. One is lying down. The other is sitting and rocking back and forth. Dan watches for 30 seconds. Then he grabs the drawbar and walks down the slope toward them. He's no hero. He's a logistics engineer from Ohio. He's drawn up schematics for vaccine refrigerators and has never saved anyone in his life. But he sees two people on the road, and he has boiled water and a multi-tool. The wagon is tipped on its side. The axle has snapped. The wheel has come off. The horse is pinned by the shaft and has broken its leg. It's already stiff. So this happened during the night. That sound. They were trying to pull it out. A man is lying nearby. He's conscious, but his leg is sticking out at a wrong angle. An open fracture. Without immobilization, he won't be able to stand. A girl of about 14 is sitting next to him. Her face is covered in blood. Her eyes are dry and empty. She isn't crying. Behind the wagon on the ground lies a woman's body, covered with a cloth. She's been dead for a long time. They were taking her to be buried. The girl lifts her head and looks at Dan. There is no hope in that gaze. Only weariness. The man opens his eyes. He wheezes that he has nothing to give. Dan crouches down. He looks at the leg, at the girl, at the cart, and speaks calmly. I won't take anything. I'll fix your axle. But first, the leg. The man looks at him as if he's crazy. Dan is already at work. First, water. A ditch. A helmet. A fire. Boiling water. While the water is heating up, he inspects the cart. The front axle is broken at the pin mount. The rear one is intact. The horse is dead. There's no one to pull it, so the rear axle isn't needed. He removes the rear pin and attaches it to the front axle. A classic swap. He's done this with trucks hundreds of times. The principle is the same. The scale is different. The water boils. He tears the bottom of his shirt, dips it in the boiling water. The man says a name. Thomas Tarrant. The girl is his daughter, Anna. Dan finds two pieces of a shaft, straight, sturdy. He places them against the leg on both sides. He takes off his belt, secures it. Thomas hisses through clenched teeth, wraps a hot cloth around it. Not perfect, but the bone is stabilized. The infection hasn't set in yet. There's time. Then the wagon. 20 minutes. A multi-tool. Unscrew the rear pin. Align it with the front axle. Hammer it in with a stone. Check for play. It holds. He lifts the cart by himself. A lever made from a shaft and a stone for support. Physics doesn't lie in any world. The cart stands on its wheels. Anna watches silently. Her mouth is slightly open. Her eyes are no longer empty. She asks quietly, "How did he do that?" Dan shrugs. "Just by swap two pieces of metal." Thomas lies there and cries. Not from pain, from something else. Dan ties the Terran cart's drawbar to the back of his own cart. It turns into a crooked, ridiculous convoy of 2 units. But it works. He grabs the drawbar, pulls. It's hard, very hard, but the wheels turn. Anna silently stands beside him and takes hold of the shaft to his left. She doesn't look. She just pulls. They move forward. By noon, they find a grove, a stream 30 paces away. Dan boils water. He soaks the bread and gives it to Thomas, then to Anna. She eats quickly, like an animal afraid it will be taken away. He writes in his notebook, Day 2, 2 people, broken leg, dehydration, need to hunt, a proper splint, shelter for the night. And that's when it happens. A quiet creak. Not from the wheels. Dan turns around. The bent arch over the body of his cart is moving. Slowly, as if someone invisible is straightening it with their hands. The arch straightens out, and fabric stretches over it with a rustle. From where? Dan doesn't understand. The fabric just appears. Thick, dark green. It pulls tight over the arch and secures itself. An awning stands over the bed. A tent. Small, but real. Anna watches. Thomas props himself up on his elbow and stares. Dan touches the fabric. Real. He runs his hand along the arch. The metal is warm, as if alive. He speaks softly. All right, I don't know what that was, but I'm not going to argue with a free roof. He helps Thomas climb under the awning, then Anna. Then he climbs in himself. It's cramped for 3 of them, but dry and almost warm. Anna lies down next to her father and is asleep within a minute. Thomas looks at Dan in the dim light, asks who he is. Dan thinks and answers honestly. He's nobody, a man with a cart, but he knows how to boil water and fix axles, and right now, that's enough. Dan sits in the dark and listens to the breathing of 2 strangers, his people, because they belong to no one else. The cart stands still. The tarp doesn't move. but he could swear it's warm, as if content. Dan woke up from the cold. Dew had seeped under the tarp and settled on his face like fine grains of sand. Anna was sniffling nearby. Thomas was breathing heavily, but evenly. The leg in the homemade splint hadn't swollen overnight. A good sign. Dan crawled outside. The morning was quiet. The grove stood in the fog. A stream murmured 30 paces away. Dan stretched his back and began to take stock. No food. The bread ran out yesterday. There is water, but it has to be boiled every time. Thomas can't walk. Anna can move, but is weak. The direction is unknown. There's no map. He has no idea about the terrain. He doesn't know where the nearest town is. He doesn't know where it's safe. He doesn't know what kind of creatures roam this plain. The only thing he knows is that he can't stay put. Food won't come to him. He grabbed his helmet and headed to the stream. He filled his canteen with water. He built a fire. While the water was heating up, he walked around the grove. 30 trees, maybe 40. The bark is tough. The wood is dense. Good for stakes and handles. Moss under the trees. Mushrooms in the moss. Small ones. Whitish caps. Dan didn't take the risk. He's no mycologist. Getting mushroom poisoning on the third day in a new world is a bad plan. But next to the mushrooms, he found something better. Roots. Thick, knotty roots sticking out of the ground. He dug one up, cut it open with his multi-tool. White flesh inside. It smells like starch. It looks like parsnip or some local equivalent. He cut off a small piece, chewed it. It's bitter but doesn't burn. No numbness in his tongue, no sharp taste of poisonous alkali. He waited 20 minutes. Nothing. His stomach didn't cramp up. His head didn't spin. He dug up 6 more roots. He sliced them and tossed them into boiling water in the helmet. It turned into something like liquid porridge. It tasted like boiled cardboard, but it was calories. He took it to Thomas. Thomas ate, grimacing but eating. Anna ate in silence, just as she did everything else. Silently. Dan jotted it down in his notebook. White edible roots, found under trees in mossy soil. Boil for at least 10 minutes. It had no taste, but his stomach accepted it. While he was writing, Anna came over and stood beside him. He looked up. She was looking at the notebook. Then she spoke. The first word he'd ever heard from her, not counting that question about the wagon. She said she knew how to set snares for small game. Her father had taught her. Dan looked at her, then at the grove. Then he asked what was needed for the snares. She needed thin rope or twine and a flexible twig. They had rope, from the Terran cart, thin hemp rope. There were plenty of flexible twigs in the grove. An hour later, Anna had set 4 snares at the edge of the grove by the stream. Dan watched her work. Her hands were steady. The knots were precise. The loops were at the right height. Whoever taught this girl knew what they were doing. Dan nodded. He told her she was doing a great job. Anna didn't answer, but Dan noticed how she straightened her back slightly. While Anna was setting the snares, Dan worked on the wagon. The left front wheel. It was loose. He took the wheel off. He inspected the pin. It was worn down. He needed a new one or a washer. He cut a strip of leather from the strap on the Terran cart. He wrapped it around the pin, hammered it back in. The play was gone. Then he examined the awning's frame. Yesterday it had moved on its own. Today it was motionless, just a metal frame with fabric stretched over it. He tapped it with his knuckles. Nothing. He felt the thick, seamless, as if woven from a single piece. He jotted it down in his notebook. The cart. The awning appeared after the Terranovs were rescued. A connection, a question, no answer yet. By evening, 2 of the 4 snares had caught prey, small animals resembling large ground squirrels. Anna brought them in by their hind legs. Dan cleaned them up with his multi-tool. There wasn't much meat, but it would be enough for a stew with roots. He cooked the meat for a long time, longer than necessary for the taste, but long enough for safety. Parasites die during prolonged cooking. He wasn't about to lose people over raw meat. That evening, the 3 of them sat under the tarp. Their first proper dinner, hot stew with meat and roots, in a helmet. They took turns eating because there was only one spoon, a wooden one, from the Terran's wagon. Thomas ate and spoke quietly. They were from a village called Snow Hills. Small, 30 households. It used to be. A month ago the creatures came, not big, in packs, about the size of a dog. Lots of them. The village didn't hold out. Thomas's wife died during the retreat, from a piece of stone that broke off a collapsing wall. He and Anna fled in a cart with her body. They were heading for Greyford. but the gates were closed. A guard shouted down that the city wasn't taking in anyone. They drove on. At night, a wheel broke. Dan listened and took it all in, not in a notebook. This wasn't for notes. This was for memory. Snow hills, 30 yards. Pack animals the size of dogs. Greyford is closed to refugees. So that's the city they kicked him out of. Greyford. So Greyford kicks people out and doesn't take people in. So Greyford is rotting from the inside. Dan asked what lay to the northeast of this place. Thomas thought for a moment. He said there were 3 streams there, a place the locals call 3 rivers. Between the streams are hills and ravines. The creatures don't go there because the water is fast and noisy. The noise scares them away. Not all of them, but definitely the small pack animals. Dan nodded. 3 rivers. Water. Shelter from small creatures. Hilly terrain means good visibility. 3 streams means fish. If there are fish there, that's the goal. He told the Terrans that tomorrow they would head northeast, to the 3 rivers. Anna asked why. Dan said it was safer there. Thomas asked how he knew. Dan replied that he didn't know for sure. But the noisy water scared away the small creatures that travel in packs, and that was a good sign. And 3 streams meant they wouldn't die of thirst. Thomas was silent and nodded. Anna said nothing. In the morning they set off. Dan led the way. Anna walked beside him. The road ran across a plain, not a tree, not a rock. Open space in every direction. Dan didn't like it. Open space meant you could see far. But they could see you from far away too. He walked faster than usual. Anna didn't complain. By noon, the plain began to rise. Hills appeared. The grass grew taller, greener. It smelled of water, wet earth, life. An hour later, Dan heard a sound. Water, fast moving. They came to the bank of the first stream. It was wider than Dan had expected. About 4 meters. Knee-deep, maybe waist-deep in the middle. The current was strong. The water was clear. The bottom was rocky. Dan crouched down and scooped up a handful with his palm. He tasted it. Clean, cold. It tasted of stone and nothing else. He surveyed the bank. Bushes on both sides. Behind the bushes, a hill. Gentle. You could see far from the top. A good spot. He walked 300 paces upstream along the bank. He found what he was looking for. A bend. The stream made a turn and formed a small backwater. The water was shallow in the backwater. The rocks were flat. An ideal place to camp. The water was 30 paces away. The hill for a vantage point was 100 paces away. The brush provided natural shelter from the wind and prying eyes. He went back for the cart and led the wagon train to the backwater. He set the cart down on level ground. He untied the Taranov's wagon. He helped Thomas get closer to the water. He examined his leg. There was swelling, but it was moderate. The skin color was normal. Blood circulation was not impaired. If there was no infection, it would heal. It would be crooked, but it would heal. Dan built a fire. He boiled water. He brewed the roots he had dug up in the grove. Dinner. Then he sat on top of the hill and looked out over the landscape. To the north, a second stream was visible, the glint of water between the hills. To the east, a strip of forest, dark, dense. To the west, the plain from which they had come. To the south, nothing, a wasteland. Dan drew a map in his notebook, roughly drawn, but a map. The first stream here, the second stream there, the forest there, the plain there. He marked the backwater with a cross, wrote next to it, camp. Then he made a list. Things to do in the first week. First, scout out the second and third streams. Second, find a food source better than roots and ground squirrels. Third, make Thomas a proper splint out of wood. Fourth, build something sturdier than the tarp. Fifth, figure out how the cart works. He closed the notebook and went back down. Anna was sitting by the stream, her feet in the water. She was watching the current. Dan sat down next to her, not too close. She was silent. So was he. 5 minutes later, she said that her mom loved water, that they used to live by a stream in Snow Hills, that her mom used to do laundry in the stream and sing. Dan listened. Then he said there was a stream here too, that you could do laundry here. Anna looked at him. For the first time in 2 days, there was something in her eyes besides exhaustion and emptiness. Something small, like a spark in a wet fire pit. She nodded and pulled her feet out of the water. She went under the tarp. Dan sat there for another 10 minutes. He listened to the water. Then he stood up and went to check the perimeter. A habit he'd never had before, but one that had appeared on its own, because now there were people sleeping behind him. On the 5th day, Dan found a third stream. It was shallower than the other 2, but wider. The current was slower. The banks were gentle. And there were fish in it. Small, silvery, and nimble. Dan isn't a fisherman, but he's an engineer. He cut some twigs from the bushes, wove something like a fish trap, clumsy, crooked, but functional. He set it up in a narrow spot where the stream ran between the rocks. 3 hours later, there were 6 little fish in the trap. Small ones, but 6. He brought them back to camp. Anna looked at the fish, then at Dan. She said it was the ugliest trap she'd ever seen. Dan said the fish thought so too, and had swum in to take a closer look. Anna didn't laugh, but the corner of her mouth twitched. It was almost the same thing. Thomas that day tried to stand up for the first time, leaning on a cane that Dan had carved from the straightest trunk in the grove. Dan had bandaged his leg. He removed the first homemade splint and made a new one. 2 smooth planks carved from solid wood with a multi-tool. He wrapped them with strips of cloth, tightly, but with a layer of moss for softness. Thomas stood up. He swayed, but he stood. His face contorted with pain, but he stood. Dan stood nearby, ready to catch him. But he didn't catch him. He waited. Thomas took 1 step, then a second. Then he said he couldn't walk yet, but he could stand. Dan nodded. He said that standing was good. Standing was the beginning. By the end of the first week, they had a camp. Small, crooked, but a camp. A tarp over the cart, a fire pit lined with stones, a fishing spot in the stream that yielded 4 to 6 small fish a day. Anna's snares that brought in a ground squirrel every other time. A supply of boiled water in 2 clay shards that Dan found among the debris of something on the bank of the second stream. Thomas's tire. A map of the area in a notebook. A to-do list for each day. The daily routine. Morning. Wake up at dawn. Water. Breakfast. Check the snares. Check the fishing spot. Repairs and work until noon. Lunch. Reconnaissance or gathering supplies until evening. Dinner. Checking the perimeter. Sleep. Dan established this schedule on the 3rd day. Thomas and Anna didn't argue. They just did it. Because when you have a schedule, you have order. And when there's order, there's a sense that someone knows what they're doing, even if that someone isn't sure themselves. On the evening of the 7th day, Dan sat by the fire and sharpened his multi-tool on a stone. Anna was sleeping under the tarp. Thomas sat next to him and silently watched the fire. Then he said quietly, "Thank you." Dan said, "You're welcome." Thomas shook his head. He said it wasn't for the leg or the food, but for the fact that Anna to eat tomorrow. Dan didn't answer. He stared at the fire and thought about how, in a week, the lives of 3 people would depend on a reed stalk and ugly roots, and that it wasn't reliable, and that they needed more. More food, more tools, more hands. But now, right now, 2 people were sleeping and sitting next to him, alive, and that was enough for the end of the first week. On the 9th day, Dan went on a scouting mission farther than usual. Anna stayed at the camp with Thomas. He took a canteen and a multi-tool with him and walked north along the second stream. The terrain was changing. The hills were getting higher. The underbrush was thicker. Trees appeared. Not a grove, but individual trunks scattered across the slopes like sentries. He walked for 2 hours. Then he saw smoke. A thin, gray wisp rose from behind a hill half a kilometer away. Dan stopped. Smoke meant people, or creatures that had taken over a human settlement, or a trap. He circled the hill. He crawled up the slope. He peered over the crest. Down below, in a small hollow, stood 3 huts, if you could call them that, stone walls, roofs of turf and branches. A fire burned in front of them. 2 people sat by the fire, an old man and an old woman, thin, gray. Their clothes hung on them like on hangers. The old man was stirring something in a pot. The old woman was mending a rag. Next to the huts, Dan saw a garden, a small one. Garden beds. Something was growing, green, alive. They had a garden. That meant 2 things. First, they'd been here a long time. Second, the land in the wastelands wasn't dead. You could grow things on it. Dan didn't hide. He stood up straight on the ridge, raised his hands, empty palms forward, and he began to descend, slowly. The old man saw him first, grabbed something from the ground, an axe, small, rusty, but an axe. Dan stopped 20 paces away. He identified himself. He said he had a camp to the south, 2 wounded men. He was no enemy. He was looking for food and people. The old man didn't lower the axe. The old woman stood up and went into the hut. Dan waited. A minute later, the old woman came out. In her hands, she held a crossbow, a small one, a hand crossbow. The bolt was aimed at Dan's chest. Dan didn't move. He said that if they fired, he wouldn't be able to tell them how to fix the sagging roof on the middle hut, because it's sagging and will collapse by winter. The old man blinked. He looked at the middle hut. The roof was indeed sagging in the center. He asked how Dan knew. Dan replied that the beam in the center had cracked. You could tell by the way the turf had sunk right in the middle. If they didn't put up a prop before the rains, the water would soak through the turf, the weight would triple, and the roof would collapse. The old man slowly lowered his axe. The old woman didn't lower her crossbow, but she wasn't aiming for the chest anymore. She was aiming for the legs. Progress. Their names were Born and Meg. They had lived here for 4 years. They had fled from a small town in the east when it fell, not from the beasts, from the plague, a disease that consumed people in a week. The skin would be covered in black spots, and the person would burn up in a fever. They left, found this place, built huts, planted a garden, survived. 4 years together in the wastelands. Dan listened and took stock. 2 old people, 4 years. A vegetable garden that works. That meant the land yielded crops. It meant food could be grown. It meant his plan for the 3 rivers wasn't crazy. He asked what was growing. Bourne listed them. Turnips, something like carrots, only bitter. Beans, onions, medicinal herbs. Meg added that they'd brought the seeds with them, and that their supply was almost gone. The seeds were their greatest treasure, more important than food, more important than water. Because you can eat food once, but seeds provide food again and again. Dan nodded. He understood. He understood better than they thought. In his past life, he had worked with humanitarian missions. Seeds and clean water were the 2 things that saved more lives than any weapon. He proposed a deal. He would fix the roof, right now. In exchange, they would give him a handful of seeds, any kind, whatever they didn't mind parting with. Bourne and Meg exchanged glances. Meg asked what else he wanted. Dan said nothing, just seeds. And if they ever wanted, he'd tell them how to make a sand filter for water so they wouldn't get sick from the raw stream. Bourne asked what a sand filter was. Dan explained. 3 layers: coarse gravel, fine gravel, sand. Water flows through them from top to bottom. The dirt stays behind. It comes out clean. Not perfectly clean, but 10 times cleaner than straight from the stream. Bourne stared at him with his mouth open. Then he turned to Meg and said that this man was a sorcerer. Meg replied that sorcerers don't fix roofs. Dan fixed the roof in 2 hours. He found a suitable log. He whittled it down with a multi-tool. He placed it under the center beam as a support. Wedged it in with stones. The sag was gone. Then he showed Bourne how to check the other beams for cracks. A simple method. Press down from above and look down. If it bends more than a finger's width, it needs to be replaced. Bourne listened, nodding. Meg brought a small bag. It contained seeds, turnips, and beans. Not much, maybe enough for 2 garden beds. But it was a start. Dan took the bag and said he'd be back. Bourne said they weren't calling him anywhere or waiting for him. Meg told him to go with God. Dan headed back. Halfway to the camp, he stopped. He sat down on a rock. He opened his notebook. He marked a spot on the map north of the camp. He wrote, Bourne and Meg, huts, vegetable garden, seeds. Then he wrote below that, first contact. He underlined it twice. Back at camp, news was waiting for him. Bad news. While he was away on the hill by the ravine, tracks had appeared. Anna found them when she went to check the snares. Paw prints, large ones, 3 toes with claws, deep indentations in the soft earth. Something large had passed along the crest of the hill. It had passed and gone, but it had been here, near the camp, near the tarp under which 3 people had slept. Dan examined the tracks. A long stride, more than a meter, long claws, a heavy creature. This isn't a pack of small creatures like the ones that destroyed Snow Hills. This was something solitary and large. He returned to camp. He didn't tell Thomas. Thomas couldn't go anywhere anyway, but he spoke with Anna. He told her that from this day forward, she wasn't to go more than 100 paces from the camp. Anna asked why. Dan showed her the tracks. She turned pale, but didn't panic. She nodded. Dan thought, a solitary creature, large. It passed by. It didn't attack. Why? Either it didn't notice. Unlikely. The tracks ran right along the ridge from which the camp is as plain as day. Or it wasn't interested. 3 people in a cart aren't much of a catch for something big. Or it was a scout. It passed by, looked, memorized. It'll come back later, with friends or without. The third option is the worst. Dan sat up all night without sleeping a wink. He didn't light a fire. Darkness, silence, the stream, the wind, nothing. The creature didn't return, not that night, nor the next. On the 11th day, a girl came. Dan found her in the morning when he went down to the stream for water. She was sitting on a rock right by the water, small, skinny, red hair tangled in knots. Her dress was torn and dirty, barefoot. She was holding a wooden spoon in her hand. She was holding it so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Dan stopped 10 paces away. The girl didn't turn around. She was staring at the water. He told her his name was Dan, that he had hot food, that he wouldn't hurt her. The girl didn't move. He sat down on the ground 10 paces away from her, just sat down, and waited. 10 minutes passed, 20, half an hour. She didn't move, and he didn't move. Then she turned her head and looked at him. Green eyes, huge on her small, gaunt face. Empty, just as empty as Anna's had been on the first day. Only worse, because Anna was 14 and she had a father. This girl was 10 or 11 years old and she had only a wooden spoon. Dan didn't move. He didn't reach out his hand. He didn't smile. He just sat there and watched calmly. She stood up, took 2 steps forward, stopped. He didn't move. She took another step. Dan slowly pulled a piece of boiled root from his pocket, the one he'd brought with him that morning. He placed it on the rock between them. He stepped back. She grabbed the root and shoved it whole into her mouth. She chewed quickly. She swallowed without chewing. She choked. Dan quietly told her to eat more slowly, that the food wasn't going anywhere. She didn't listen. She ate it all in 30 seconds. Then she looked at him. Dan stood up, slowly. He told her to follow him if she wanted to. He walked toward the camp without looking back. A minute later, he heard footsteps behind him. Small ones, barefoot on the rocks. She was following him. At the camp, Anna saw the girl and froze. Then, silently, she poured some soup into a bowl for her. The girl ate, drank, ate, drank. Thomas watched her from under the tarp and said nothing. Dan sat nearby and waited. When she had finished eating, she still hadn't spoken. Dan didn't ask. He gave her a rag soaked in warm water. She didn't understand. He gestured. Wash up. She washed up. Beneath the dirt, her face was covered in freckles. Her red hair, without the tangles, would have been curly and bright. About 11, maybe 10. She lay down by the fire, clutching the spoon to her chest, and fell asleep a minute later. Dan covered her with his jacket. In the evening, the wagon creaked. Dan turned around. A new object had appeared in the bed next to the supply bag. Flat. Metal. Foldable. He pulled it out, unfolded it. It was a small grate on legs, and next to it, a small iron pot, about the size of 2 fists, with a lid, with a handle. Dan placed the grate over the dying fire. He set the pot on it. He understood. A kitchen. A camp kitchen. Level 2. The cart had given him the chance to cook properly. Not in a helmet, not on rocks, in a pot, on a grate, for 4 people. He sat in front of that little pot and looked at it as if it were a miracle, because it was a miracle. Small, practical, bland if described on paper. But for a man who had been cooking soup in a rusty helmet for 10 days, it was a leap forward in civilization. The girl spoke the next morning. One word. Lily. Dan asked her to repeat it. She did. Lily. Her name. Dan nodded. He said his name was Dan, and that she could stay as long as she wanted. Lily looked at him, then at the spoon in her hand, then back at him, and she stayed. Lily didn't speak. She said her name that first morning and fell silent again. Dan didn't press her. He'd seen children like this in the news, from humanitarian zones, when the brain decides that silence is safer than words. She followed Dan like a shadow, 3 steps behind, no closer, no farther. If he stopped, she stopped. If he sat down, she sat down. She never let go of her spoon. She slept with it, she ate with it. She washed herself with one hand because the other held the spoon. Anna treated Lily strangely, not hostile, but wary, like a cat toward a strange kitten. She didn't speak to her, but silently divided the food equally, silently gave her a spot by the fire closer to the flames, silently laid her rag next to hers when the nights grew colder. Thomas simply accepted it. He accepted everything Dan did, as if he'd decided once and for all that this strange man knew what he was doing and never reconsidered that decision. Dan took charge of the cooking. The new pot changed everything. Before, he could only boil things. Now he could simmer, braise, make decoctions, steep herbs. He experimented with roots. He found that if he boiled them for 2 hours over low heat, the bitterness went away. The flavor didn't come out, but the bitterness went away. That was already better. He hadn't planted the beans from Bourne's seeds yet. He waited. He looked at the soil. He searched for a spot. You can't just make a garden bed anywhere. You need soil that holds water but doesn't get waterlogged. You need light. You need protection from the wind. On the 13th day, he found a suitable spot, the southern slope of a hill near the backwater. The soil is soft. Water runs off but doesn't flood it. Sun for half the day. The ridge blocks the wind. He started digging, with a multi-tool and a stick, slowly, a 2 by 2 meter square. Not a garden bed, but more of a test. If the soil yields a crop, he'll expand it. If not, he'd know the garden beds needed to be somewhere else. Lily walked over and stood watching him dig. Then she picked up a stick and started digging next to him, in silence. Dan didn't say a word. He just shifted over and made room for her. They dug together for an hour. Then Lily got tired and lay down next to the garden bed, pressing a spoon to her chest. She fell asleep. Dan dug for another hour by himself. By evening, the garden bed was ready. He planted half the beans, 16 of them. He put the other half in a small bag and hid it in the cart. Never plant all the seeds. That's rule number 1. If the first crop fails, you need a reserve for a second try. He watered the garden from his helmet. Water from the stream, unboiled. You don't need to boil it for watering, but you must for drinking, not for watering. It's a small thing, but survival is made up of such small things. On the 14th day, tracks appeared on the ridge again. The same 3-toed ones, the same deep ones. But now there were others too, a different size, smaller, 2 creatures. They had crossed the ridge at night. They went down to the stream. They drank their fill. They headed east toward the forest. Dan stood over the tracks and thought, 2 is worse than 1, but they came to the water, not to the camp. So the camp isn't the target yet. Not yet. He needs protection. Not a wall, not a fortress. He couldn't build either with a multi-tool and 3 helpers, one of whom had a broken leg, one a teenager, and one a non-speaking child. He needed an early warning system, something that would tell him someone was coming before that someone arrived. He began gathering materials. There was a rope in the Terran cart, about 20 meters of it. In the debris on the bank of the second stream, he found rusty nails and pieces of tin. In the grove, he cut thin twigs. He worked all day. By evening, a line of twigs stood around the camp at a distance of 50 paces, stuck into the ground. A rope was stretched between them at knee height. Pieces of tin hung from the rope every 3 steps. When the rope was pulled tight, the tin clinked against each other. It jingled. Not loudly, but enough in the silence of the night. Bells made of trash. A perimeter system. Dan tested it. He walked through the line himself. The tin clinked, quietly but distinctly. He walked through again, deliberately quietly. It jingled again. Good. Anna watched the process with a strange expression on her face. When Dan was done, she came over and said that in her village, hunters had made something similar but with bone beads. Dan asked if it had worked. Anna said it had worked until the village burned down. Dan said nothing. On the 15th day, he returned to Bourne and Meg. He brought fish with him, 6 from that morning's catch, a gift. Bourne met him without an axe, Meg without a crossbow. Progress. The roof was holding, the prop was standing. Bourne said that after the repairs, it had stopped leaking inside. Dan nodded and offered to show them the sand filter. They agreed. He built the filter in 3 hours. He found a suitable clay container with a crack in the house. He patched the crack with a mixture of clay and ash. He dried it over a fire. He poured in layers. Coarse gravel, fine gravel, sand. Trod it down, packed it tight, poured water on top. Water trickled out from a small hole at the bottom. Cleaner, noticeably cleaner. Meg tasted it. Her expression changed. She said she'd been drinking murky water for 4 years and thought that's just how it was supposed to be. Dan said it wasn't, and that murky water was responsible for half the diseases that kill people in the wastelands. Bourne listened very carefully. Then he said that Dan had strange knowledge for a drifter. Dan replied that he wasn't a drifter. He was an engineer. Bourne asked what an engineer was. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said that an engineer was a person who made things work. Bourne nodded and said he understood. Then he asked if an engineer could fix the well. Dan asked which well. Bourne led him behind the huts. There, 20 paces away, stood a stone structure, a well, an old one, filled in. Bourne said that when they first came here, the well was open, but the water in it stank. They had filled it with stones and started going to the stream. Dan peered into the well. The masonry was vertical, about 5 meters deep, half filled with debris and stones, but the structure was intact. Dan asked what the water smelled like. Bourne said rotten eggs. Dan understood. Hydrogen sulfide. Stagnant water at the bottom with no inflow. Organic matter is rotting. The water is spoiling. But if we clear it out, open up the bottom, and let water flow in from the ground, the water will be refreshed. The well can be restored. It's a job that will take a few days. Not for one person, 2 or 3 people. But the result is worth it. A well is a constant source of water. Not a stream that can dry up. Not rain that might not come. A well. Dan told Bourne he could fix it, but not alone. He needs help. Bourne asked what he wanted in return. Dan said nothing. Bourne frowned and said that free help is more suspicious than paid help. Dan replied that he wants one thing. If anyone hungry ever comes to Bourne and Meg, they'll give him something to eat. And they'd tell him about the camp by the mill in the south. Bourne looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. On the 16th day, Dan began clearing out the well. Alone. Bourne was too old for hard work, but he helped. He handed him the rope, held it, carried stones. Meg fed him. Turnips and beans. Hot. With salt. They had salt. A small bag. Dan didn't ask where it came from. Salt in the wastelands is life. He worked for 3 days. He walked from the camp to the huts and back. Every evening he checked the perimeter. The tin bells rang twice. Both times it was the wind. Not a creature. But Dan didn't let his guard down. On the 18th day, the well was cleared to the bottom. The bottom was muddy, wet. Dan poked at the mud with a stick. Water emerged from beneath the mud. Murky at first, then clearer. He waited 2 hours. The water rose 1/2 meter. It smelled like earth, not rotten eggs. He cupped some in his hand, tasted it. Damp, mineral water, but clean. Run it through a sand filter, and it's drinkable. Bourne stood at the edge of the well and looked down. Then he said quietly that in 4 years, not a single person had helped them. Not one. They passed by, they saw the huts, and they kept walking. Dan climbed out of the well, wet and dirty. He said that it's easier to walk by, but walking by doesn't feed you. On the 19th day, Dan returned to camp and found Anna crying. For the first time ever. She was sitting by the stream, crying quietly with her arms wrapped around her knees. Lily was sitting 3 steps away, silently, with a spoon. Dan walked over. He sat down beside her. He didn't ask. 10 minutes later, Anna said that today was her mother's birthday. Dan was silent. Anna said that her mother loved beans. It was funny, silly, but she loved beans. And now they had beans in the garden that hadn't sprouted yet, and her mother would never get to taste them. Dan sat there and said nothing. Then he said one thing. He said that when the beans grew, the first pod would be for her mother. They would pick it and place it by the water, because Anna said her mother loved water. Anna looked at him, then she nodded. She wiped her face. She stood up. She walked over to the tent. Lily stayed sitting by the stream. Then she looked at Dan, and for the first time in a week, she spoke a word. Not her name, another word. She said, "Kind," quietly, almost in a whisper, and fell silent again. Dan sat by the stream and watched the water. Then he wrote in his notebook. Day 19, population 4, 2 allies a half-hour's walk away, seeds planted, the well is working, the perimeter is up, large creatures spotted twice, no contact. Next step, we need people, we need tools, we need weapons. He closed the notebook. He looked at the cart with the tarp, at the cauldron over the cooled-down coals, at the garden plot on the slope, at the perimeter of twigs and tin, at the small camp of 4 people in the wastelands under a foreign sky. 20 days ago, he had been lying on a dusty road, not knowing where he was. Now he had people, a roof, food, water, seeds, allies, a map, a plan. Not a single weapon except a multi-tool. Not a single fighter except a 14-year-old girl with a noose. But that was more than 20 days ago, much more. On the 21st day, Hyejin-so arrived. Dan didn't see her approach. He heard her. Bells jingled. A sharp psst, not the wind. Something had struck the rope with force. Dan jumped up. He grabbed the stick he'd been keeping by the tent as a makeshift weapon. He peeked out from behind the cart. A woman was standing on the perimeter line. Tall, thin. Not skinny like Lily or Bourne, but thin, taut, like a rope stretched to its limit. Dark hair tied in a knot at the nape of her neck. A diagonal scar ran across her left eyebrow. White. Old. She was wearing chainmail, worn, with holes on the right side. Under the chainmail was a dirty quilted jacket. On her feet were boots with worn-out soles. In her right hand she held a spear. Long. The shaft was cracked in 2 places and wrapped in rags. The tip gleamed dully. A bag hung behind her back. It looked empty. She stood and looked at Dan. He stood and looked at her. Anna peeked out from behind the awning. Thomas propped himself up on his elbow. Lily hid behind the cart. The woman stepped over the rope. The bells jingled again. She looked at them, then at the bars, then at the tin, then at Dan again. She said it was the silliest signal line she'd ever seen. But it works. Dan didn't lower his stick. He asked who she was. She gave her name, Hyejin-so, former lieutenant of the Greyford City Guard. Former. Dan asked again. She confirmed it. Former. She said she'd been fired 3 weeks ago, for refusing to follow an order. Dan asked what order. She paused. Then she said, the order to shoot at the refugees at the gate. A family with children from a fallen village. They were pounding, begging to be let in. The commander gave the order to shoot arrows over their heads, then a second order, to shoot at their legs. Hyejin refused. They disarmed her. They threw her out the gate. Without supplies, without papers. With a spear they tossed after her because the captain said he felt sorry for the toothless dog. Dan lowered his stick. Hyejin looked at the camp, at the tent, at the cauldron, at the garden, at the tin bells, at Anna by the tent, at the masa under the tent, at the cart. She said she'd heard about a madman gathering people in the wastelands. A peasant by the abandoned bridge had told her. Then an old woman by the huts in the north had pointed the way. Dan made a mental note. Meg. Meg had shown her the way. So it had worked. Hyejin asked if she could stay for the night. Just for the night. She'd leave in the morning. Dan said one night wasn't enough. Let her stay. Hyejin looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Then she nodded. She stuck her spear into the ground next to the tent and sat down. On the first evening, Hyejin didn't speak to the others. She ate her soup in silence. She surveyed the camp with a professional eye. Dan could see her calculating, assessing. The perimeter, the view, escape routes, water sources, cover. She was a soldier to the core. Even now. Cast out. Alone. Hungry. Her first move was to assess the position. She didn't sleep that night. Dan knew because he hadn't slept either. He saw her sitting on the crest of the hill with a spear across her knees, staring into the darkness. In the morning, she approached him. She said the camp's position was poor. The stream was good for water, but the hill was open on 3 sides. The brush provided cover from the wind, but not from arrows. The line of bells warned, but didn't hold them back. One creature could step over it and not even notice. A group of men could cut the rope in a second. Dan listened. She was right. He knew it himself, but he lacked the military experience to articulate it. He asked what she suggested. She suggested moving the camp 200 paces south. There, a bend in the stream forms a loop. Water on 3 sides. The 4th side is a hill. Set up camp in the loop and block the only dry approach with logs. Not a wall, but a barrier. Dan thought about it. He looked at the map in his notebook. The bend. He had seen it, but hadn't thought of it as a position. He had thought of it as a place for a camp. Hyejin thought of it as a fortress. He nodded, said, "Okay, let's move." Hyejin blinked. She asked so simply. Dan replied that she was a soldier and he wasn't. If she says the position is better, then the position is better. He had no reason to argue with someone who knew more than he did. Hyejin looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she said that in 10 years in the Guard, not a single commander had ever said those words to her. Dan shrugged and began packing up camp. The move took a day, a hard day, a cart, a tar. Thomas was on a stretcher made of poles that he and Anna had fashioned that morning. Lily carried the pot with both hands, holding the spoon against her side with her elbow. Hajin carried everything else, alone. She was stronger than she looked, much stronger. The new camp in the bend of the stream was different. Water murmured on three sides. The sound was constant, soothing. The space inside the bend was flat and dry, 30 by 20 meters, enough for a tent, a place for a fire, and a place to work. The hill behind her sheltered her from the north wind. The only dry approach was 5 meters wide. Hegan spent the rest of the day building a barricade. She chopped down trees, not with a multi-tool. She had found a rusty axe in the ravine, or brought it with her. Dan didn't ask. She chopped down 4 trees. She laid them across the path, not pretty, but impassable for anything that couldn't climb over a 5-foot pile of intertwined trunks. Dan moved the rope with bells to the new perimeter, set it further out, 70 paces instead of 50. Hegan approved. Then she made a correction. She showed that another line was needed closer by, a double perimeter. The first line at 70 paces for early detection, the second at 20 for those who got past the first. Dan did it. All the remaining rope and tin went into the second line. He mentally added it to the list. Need rope. Lots of rope. In the evening, they sat around a new fire in the new camp, 5 of them. Dan, Thomas, Anna, Lily, Hejin. A stew of roots and fish in the pot. They ate in turn, 1 spoon, a wooden one. Lily passed it to each of them in turn and took it back. That was her contribution, her job, watching the spoon. Dan hadn't assigned her this job. She'd taken it on herself. Hajin ate quickly and sparingly, a soldier's habit. You never know when the next meal will come. Eat quickly and don't take more than your share. Then she stood up and went on patrol, without being asked, without an order. She just went, because someone had to. Dan watched her go and thought, that's what he'd been missing. Not a wall, not a weapon. A person who thinks of safety as their job. He's an engineer. He can build and repair and calculate and plan, but he can't build and stand guard at the same time. Now he doesn't have to. That evening, Thomas took 10 steps without a cane for the first time. Slowly, with a grimace of pain. But he took them. The leg was healing. Crooked, just as Dan had expected, but it was healing. In a month or a month and a half, he'd be able to walk normally. Limping, but walking. 2 hours after dinner, the cart creaked. Dan was already waiting. He didn't know exactly what, but he was waiting. After the tent for the Terrans and the kitchen for Lily, he'd figured out the pattern. A new person, a new module. He walked over to the cart. In the bed, next to the cauldron and the sack, lay a new object. Heavy, flat, metal. Dan pulled it out. It was an anvil, a small one, about 5 kilograms. The surface was smooth. Next to it lay 2 objects. A hammer, short, with a narrow head, and tongs. Blacksmith's tongs. Small, one-handed. A forge. Level 3. Not a real forge, of course. No bellows, but an anvil, a hammer, tongs. Tools for working with metal. Dan could now forge. Shape, straighten, make nails, repair tools. Change the shape of rusty iron and turn junk into useful things. He set the anvil on a flat rock by the fire. He placed the hammer and tongs next to it. Heijin returned from her rounds. She saw the anvil. She stopped. She looked at the cart, then at Dan. She asked where it came from. Dan said from the cart. Hagen walked over to the cart. She peered into the bed. The bed was empty, just as small as before. There was nowhere for the anvil, the hammer, or the tongs to be lying there. She turned to Dan. She said it was magic. Dan shook his head. He said he didn't know what it was, but the anvil was real, and the hammer was real, and the tongs were real. As for where it came from, he'd figure out later. Right now, it was more important to decide what to do with them. Heijin looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was the strangest person she'd ever met. Dan replied that he'd heard that before. The next morning, he repaired Heijin's spear. He removed the rags from the cracks in the shaft. He examined it. The shaft was cracked in 2 places because the wood had dried out and the fibers had split. It couldn't be repaired. He needed a new one. He went into the grove. He searched for the right trunk for 2 hours. An ash tree. Straight. No knots, the right length. 3 fingers thick. He cut it down. He whittled it down. With a multi-tool and a new hammer. He stripped the bark. He smoothed it out. He checked the balance. A spear with a new shaft should be an extension of the arm. He remembered this from documentaries and from some book he had read once. The center of gravity must be at the point of grip. If the spear leans forward, it's uncomfortable to strike. If it leans back, the swing is too long. He remembered how Heijin held her spear, her right hand a third of the way from the tip, her left in the lower quarter, a wide grip. So she needed the balance shifted slightly back from the center so the tip wouldn't pull down during long swings. He spent 2 hours adjusting the weight, shaving down here, trimming there. He attached the tip, secured it, checked it, twirled it in his hands. The shaft lay straight, smooth, warm, just right. He brought the spear to camp. Heijin was standing by the barricade, checking the fastening of the logs. He approached, held out the spear, said he'd made it to fit her hand. He'd measured while she slept, used her old shaft to determine the grip and length. Heijin took the spear, gripped it with a familiar motion, twisted it, made a lunge, swung it back. She froze. She looked at the shaft, then at Dan. Her face didn't change, not at all, not a single muscle. She said thank you. Her voice was steady. Then she turned and walked toward the crest of the hill. Dan watched her go. He couldn't see her face, but he saw her walking, and from the way she pressed the spear to her shoulder with both hands, he realized she was crying. He didn't follow her. In the evening she returned. She sat by the fire, silently, the spear beside her, new, clean, proper. She ate porridge and didn't say a word, but when Lily held out a spoon to her, Heijin smiled for the first time. Not widely, not cheerfully, just the corner of her mouth. But Lily saw it and held out the spoon again. Heijin took it. Lily sat down next to her, 3 steps away, as usual. But for Heijin, not for Dan. Dan wrote it down in his notebook. Day 22, population 5. Modules, tent, kitchen, smithy. Position at a stream bend with a barricade and a double perimeter. Weapons, 1 spear, 1 multi-tool, 1 hammer, 1 rusty axe. Food supply for 2 days. Vegetable patch with no sprouts yet. Allies, 2. Morale, he thought. Then he wrote, higher than yesterday. The caravan was joined by former guard Heijin So, expelled from Greyford for refusing to shoot at refugees. The camp was moved to a bend in the stream with a barricade and a double perimeter. The cart revealed a 3rd module containing an anvil, a hammer, and tongs. Dan made Heijin a new spear shaft, fitted to her grip. Heijin transformed the camp within a week, not outwardly, internally. With her arrival, everyone got a duty roster. The night was divided into 3 shifts. Hegan took the first, Dan took the second, Anna took the third. Thomas couldn't stand for long yet, but he sat by the fire during his shift and listened. His ears were better than his legs. Lily slept through the night. Dan insisted. Children need sleep. Hegan didn't argue. On the 24th day, Dan picked up a hammer for real for the first time. Not for a spear, for nails. He stoked the fire to make it hotter. He shoved a piece of rusty iron he'd found in the ravine into the coals. He waited for it to get red hot. He pulled it out with tongs. He placed it on the anvil. He struck it. The metal gave way. Not easily, not pretty, but it gave way. He struck and turned it, struck and turned it. 20 minutes later, he had a nail. Crooked, thick, ugly, but a nail. He cooled it in the stream, turned it between his fingers. Then he made a second one, a third. By evening, he had 11 nails. His hands were buzzing. His shoulder ached. But 11 nails meant 11 attachment points. That's a shelf, or a door, or a frame, or a sturdier trap. Anna came over and looked at the nails. She said that back in their village, the blacksmith made 100 nails a day. Dan replied that he wasn't a blacksmith, but he'd learn. Anna shrugged and went to check the snares. On the 25th day, he began to build. Not a house, a shed, open on one side. 3 walls made of poles interwoven with branches. A roof of the same poles covered with turf. It was dry inside, almost warm. Enough room for 3 to lie down. The wagon's canopy barely fit 2 people. 5 was impossible. Hagen slept on the ground by the debris. Anna slept under the terrain wagon. This wouldn't do. People who don't get enough sleep make mistakes. Mistakes in the wastes kill. He spent 2 days building the shelter. Nails held the poles. Poles held the branches. Branches held the sod. The sod held the warmth. When the shelter was ready, Dan assigned sleeping spots. Thomas and Anna in the shelter, Lily under the wagon's canopy, Hedgen under the wagon's canopy. Dan was in the shelter by the entrance. Hedgen objected. She said she didn't need a roof. Dan replied that she did, that a wet soldier is a slow soldier, that a sentry with a cold is a blind sentry, and that he wasn't going to treat her for a fever just because she decided to play hard to get. Hedgen glared at him. Then she said he was giving orders like an officer. Dan replied that he wasn't an officer. He was a logistics officer. A logistics officer counts resources. She was a resource, the most valuable one in the camp, and he wouldn't let a valuable resource get soaked in the rain out of stubbornness. Hedgen silently went under the awning. That night, the first rain fell. A wall of water crashed down in the camp at 3 a.m. Dan woke up to the sound of raindrops pounding on the tarp. The roof held. Not perfectly. It was leaking in 2 places, but it held. He leaned out. The stream had swollen. The water rose to his palm and churned. The cart stood firm. The awning hadn't been torn off. Hedgen sat dry under the awning, a spear across her knees, eyes open. She wasn't sleeping. She was watching the rain. Dan nodded to her. She nodded back. In the morning after the rain, the world had changed. The greenery around the camp had become brighter. The stream roared louder. The air smelled of earth and life, and tiny green dots were poking out of the soil in the garden bed. The beans had sprouted. Dan stood over the garden bed and looked at the sprouts. 16 holes. 11 had sprouted. A 69% germination rate. Not bad for seeds of unknown age planted in unfamiliar soil by a man who last planted something in a pot on his office windowsill. Anna came over and sat down beside him. She counted the sprouts. Then she said quietly that Mom's beans had sprouted. Dan nodded. On the 28th day, he went to see Bourne and Meg again. He brought fish and 3 nails, a gift. Bourne took the nails and held them in his palm as if they were gold. Nails were a rarity in the wastelands. Every nail is a door that closes tighter, a hinge that won't come loose, a shelf that won't collapse. Meg said that 3 days ago, a man had passed by the huts, young. He was coming from the east, hungry and sick. She fed him. She showed him the way to Dan's camp, just as he asked. The man went south. Dan remembered. Young, from the east, hungry and sick. Maybe he'll come. Maybe not. Maybe he's already dead. The wastelands don't forgive the sick and the lonely. He returned to camp. The man from the east didn't come that day, or the next, or the day after that. Dan stopped waiting. On the 30th day, Hajin said she'd found human tracks west of the camp. Not beasts, people. Boots. 4 pairs. They were walking in single file, military formation. Dan asked how she knew it was military. Hedgen said the distance between the tracks was uniform, a measured stride. That's how soldiers walk, not peasants. 4 soldiers west of the camp, between the camp and Greyford. Dan felt a chill run down his spine. Greyford, the city that had cast him out, the town that wouldn't let the Taurans in, the town that had expelled Hedgen for refusing to shoot people. He asked Hedgen what she thought. She thought for a moment. Then she said it might be a patrol, a standard patrol. Greyford sometimes sent patrols into the wastes, not to save people, to clear them out. If something appeared near the city that bothered or annoyed Lord Hallbrook, the Lord would send out a clearing party. Dan asked what clearing out meant. Hedgen replied in a steady, emotionless voice. Mopping up means killing or driving away. Looters, bandits, refugees who stand too close to the walls, anyone who doesn't belong to the city and doesn't pay the city. Dan was silent. Then he asked if they could come here. Hedgen said the tracks led southwest, past them, not toward them, not yet toward them. But if someone tells the patrol that people live in the 3 rivers, the patrol might come back. Dan thought of Bourne and Meg, of the peasant by the abandoned bridge who told Hedgen about the camp. Rumors spread, people talk. Sooner or later, the patrol will find out. He asked how much time they had. Hedgen shrugged. A week, a month, 2 months. It depends on how much Greyford cares about the wastelands right now. Dan nodded and began to plan. That evening, he gathered everyone around the fire. For the first time, before, he'd just act and the others would follow. Now he spoke. He said that Greyford's soldiers were nearby, that they might return, that the camp needed to be made invisible. Thomas asked how to make the camp invisible in the bend of the stream. Dan explained. A campfire is visible by day because of the smoke, at night because of the light. So a fire only at dawn and dusk, when the smoke is lost in the fog and haze. Cook once a day, a portion. Eat cold food the rest of the time. Cover the shelter and tarp with branches. From above, the camp should look like part of the brush. Change the paths to the stream every 3 days so as not to trample out noticeable trails. Hagen listened and nodded. She added her own thoughts. Move the latrine further down the stream, downstream. The smell attracts both animals and people. Don't throw away trash, bury it. Cover the fire pit with dirt after each use. Dan nodded. Good. They worked for 3 days. The camp had changed. From above, it now looked like a stream bank overgrown with bushes. The canopy was covered with branches. The wagon's awning was buried in leaves. The paths were worn smooth. The fire pit was camouflaged with stones that could be moved and put back in place. Anna suggested an idea. Snares on the approach to the camp. Not for game, for warning. A thin rope at ankle height. A person would trip and fall. Noise. Time to react. Dan approved. Hajin approved. Anna set 6 traps on the dry approach. On the 35th day, a person came from the east. Not the one Meg had mentioned. Another. A woman. Young. Petite. Round-faced. She was carrying a bag of herbs in her hands and a wooden box on her back. She emerged from the bushes onto the bank of the stream and stopped. She looked at the water. Then she sat down and began washing her hands. For a long time. Thoroughly. Every finger. Dan watched from behind the brush. Hejin stood nearby with her spear. The woman was unarmed. She didn't look dangerous, but Hejin didn't let her guard down. Right. Dan stepped out, identified himself, asked who she was and where she was from. She gave her name, Mina Park, a healer. She was coming from a ruined temple to the east. The temple stood by the road. The wounded were hiding there. 10 people. Mina had been treating them alone for 3 weeks. Then the looters came. Mina couldn't protect the wounded. The looters took the food, the clothes, the tools. They didn't touch the wounded. But without food and medicine, they began to die, one by one. Mina kept them alive as long as she could. She couldn't save 7 of them. 3 survived and headed west towards some town they'd heard about. Mina went south, because the old man at the huts in the north had said there was a man in the south who helps. Born again. Dan silently thanked the old man. Mina spoke softly. She smiled. But Dan saw her hands. Red, chapped, broken nails. Those hands had held dying people for 3 weeks, washed wounds, changed bandages, did what was necessary and what was impossible, and lost 7 times out of 10. Dan said she could stay. Mina nodded. She asked if there were any wounded. Dan pointed to Thomas. Mina walked over to him. She examined his leg. She removed the splint. She touched it. Thomas winced. Mina said the bone was healing properly. The splint was good. Who put it on? Dan said he did. Mina looked at him. She asked how he knew how to apply a splint. Dan said he just knew. Mina didn't press the issue. She opened her herbal bag. Inside 3 were little pouches. Dozens of pouches, small ones, tied with threads of different colors. She took one out, untied it, sniffed it, rubbed it between her fingers. Then she brewed it in the pot, gave it to Thomas, said it would reduce the inflammation and speed up healing. Thomas drank it. An hour later, he said the pain was gone. For the first time in a month, his leg didn't hurt. Mina nodded, as if that was how it was supposed to be. In the evening, Dan sat with Mina by the fire. The others were asleep. He asked how she knew about herbs. Mina said her mother had taught her. Her mother had learned from her own mother. A chain of knowledge passed down through generations. But Mina didn't know why the herbs worked. She knew which herb to give for fever, which for pain, which for inflammation. But she didn't know the mechanism. Dan thought for a moment. Then he began to speak, slowly, choosing words that would make sense in this world. He said that inflammation is when the body tries to heal itself but goes too far. Like a soldier defending a house who ends up setting it on fire. The body sends heat and swelling to kill the infection, but in the process destroys itself. The herb she gave Thomas tells the body to stop, that there's no infection, that it's okay to calm down. Mina listened without blinking. Then she asked how he knew that. Dan said that where he came from, people had been studying the body for a very long time. Mina was silent. Then she said that her whole life she had prayed before every treatment, because she didn't understand and was afraid it wouldn't work next time. Dan said that understanding doesn't kill faith, it just adds confidence. Mina looked at her hands, red, cracked. Then she said quietly that in the 3 weeks she'd been at the temple, she'd prayed 10 times. 7 out of 10 prayers hadn't helped. Dan replied quietly that it wasn't about the prayers. It was because she didn't have food or clean water or proper tools. She'd done everything she could. 3 had survived. Out of 10 hopeless cases, 3. That wasn't a failure. Mina was silent for a long time. Then her shoulders trembled. Just once. She didn't cry, but she was close. Dan didn't say anything. He just poured her some hot broth and sat down beside her. The cart creaked in the darkness. Dan turned around. Not now. Not with her here. He waited until Mina went to sleep. Then he walked over to the cart. Nothing new had appeared in the bed. But on the side of the cart, on the wooden side of the bed, a pattern had appeared. Faint, as if burned from inside the wood. A circle. Inside the circle, 6 dots. 5 along the edges. 1 in the center, Dan counted. 5 along the edges. Thomas, Anna, Lily, Hyejin, Mina. 1 in the center. Him. The cart was counting people. The cart knew how many there were. Dan ran his finger over the pattern. The wood was warm, as always. He didn't know what it meant, but he wrote it down in his notebook and underlined it 3 times. The second month began with hunger. Not real hunger, not deadly hunger, but a constant lingering feeling that there wasn't enough food. 6 people ate every day. Roots, fish, sometimes a ground squirrel from Anna's snares. Beans were growing in the garden, but harvest was still 3 weeks away. Dan counted. Every evening he opened his notebook and counted. Calories, grams, liters. A person needs at least 1,500 calories a day to function. Better yet, 2,000. They were getting about 1,000, maybe 1,200 on good days. That was enough to keep them from dying. It wasn't enough to live normally. People got tired faster. Wounds healed more slowly. Morale was dropping. Lily had lost weight. She was skinny to begin with, and now her ribs showed through her dress. Dan looked at her and clenched his teeth. He started eating less, unnoticed. He divided his portion in 2. He ate half for himself. He slipped the other half to Lily. Not directly into her hands. He left it by the cauldron, as if it were leftovers. Lily picked it up. Hyejin noticed on the 3rd day. She approached him while the others were asleep. She said quietly that if he died of starvation, the rest would die next. Because he was the only one who knew how everything worked. Dan said he wouldn't die. Hyejin said she'd cut back on her portion too. Dan said no, she's a fighter. She needs more calories than he does. Muscles weaken first without food. She won't be able to hold a spear on an empty stomach. Hyejin looked at him. She said he was an engineer and worked with his hands too. Dan replied that his hands lifted a hammer, not a spear. There's a difference. Hyejin said there was no difference. Dan said the argument was over and walked away. Hyejin clenched her jaw but said nothing. On the 40th day, Dan solved the problem. Not completely, but substantially. He found clay. The bank of the 3rd stream, half a kilometer to the east. A layer of dense, reddish clay. He brought a sample back to camp, kneaded it, added water, molded a cup, dried it in the sun, fired it in the fire. The cup cracked, the second one too. The 3rd one held up, crooked, fragile, but intact. The clay opened up possibilities, storage pots, food bowls, baking dishes, and most importantly, he could make an improved fishing net. Not from twigs that rotted after a week, made of clay. A funnel-shaped trap with a narrow entrance from which the fish couldn't escape. He spent 2 days designing it. He sketched in a notebook. He calculated the dimensions. Then he molded it, dried it, fired it, broke it, remolded it. On the 4th day, he succeeded. A clay fish trap. Heavy, ugly, but it worked. He placed it in a narrow spot on the 3rd stream, next to the wicker one. A day later, there were 12 fish in the clay trap, 4 in the wicker one. A 3-fold difference. The clay didn't let small fish through the cracks. Everything that swam in stayed. Dan made a 2nd clay trap, a 3rd. He set them in all 3 streams. The fish started biting. Not a luxury, but a steady 20 to 30 small fish a day. Small ones. But 30 small ones is a decent meal for 6 people, plus roots, plus the occasional ground squirrel. Calories rose to 1,500. The minimum for survival became the minimum for life. Lily stopped losing weight. Dan started eating normally. Hyejin stopped looking at him with that expression. On the 42nd day, Thomas stood on both feet, fully, wobbling but without a cane. His leg had healed. Crooked, he limped. He would always limp, but he was standing and could walk. Mina examined him and said the result was better than she'd expected. Dan said the result was like that because Mina had been giving him herbs every day. Mina shook her head and said the splint had been set correctly, and that was more important than the herbs. They both knew they were both right. Thomas started working on the very first day. Not hard work, but work. He turned out to be a carpenter, not a great one, a country carpenter, but he knew how to handle an axe and knew how to join log to log. Dan gave him a rusty axe and pointed to the grove. He said they needed poles. lots of poles. Thomas left and came back with 6 poles. Straight, identical, hewn. Dan looked at them and realized that Thomas wasn't just a carpenter. He was a good carpenter. He just never said so, because in his world, a carpenter is nobody. Dan said the poles were great. Thomas looked at him as if he didn't believe him. Then he grunted and went to get the next batch. In 3 days, Thomas and Dan built a second shelter, bigger than the first, with a doorway, with shelves inside, with a bed made of poles covered in moss and dry grass. A real bed, not the ground. Hedgen touched it and said it was worse at the Grayford barracks. Dan wasn't sure if she was joking or not. On the 45th day, the beans produced pods. Green, small, but pods. Anna picked the first one, carried it to the stream, placed it on a rock by the water, stood there for a minute. She came back. Her eyes were dry. Her back was straight. Dan saw but said nothing. On the 47th day, he went to Bourne and Meg with the news. He carried fish and a clay bowl, a gift. Meg took the bowl in her hands and turned it over for 10 minutes. Then she said that in 4 years they hadn't had any proper dishes. Dan said he could show them how to make them. There was enough clay on the bank of the third stream to make dozens of pots. Bourne said that people had come to see them again. Not just one person, 2. A man and a woman, young, from the west, from across the river. Their village hadn't burned down. It hadn't been attacked by the creatures. They had simply stopped being fed. The lord who owned the village had taken the entire harvest to the city and said he would feed only those who were building the wall. The old and the children were not needed. The 2 of them left. Meg showed them the way to the camp. They went. Dan returned to the camp. 2 days later, the line of bells rang out. It wasn't the wind. Hagen caught a spear. Dan went out to the perimeter. 2 people were standing on the line. A man and a woman. Young. He was about 25. She was a little younger. Both were thin, dirty, but uninjured. The man introduced himself. Rice. The woman introduced herself. Thora. They were from the village of Westmid across the river. The old woman in the north showed them the way. Dan let them in. He fed them. Hot fish stew with beans. Their first homegrown beans. Rice ate and cried. Not because of the taste, because of the heat. He said he hadn't eaten anything hot in 2 weeks. Tora ate in silence. Like Anna on the first day. Like Lily. Just the same. All hungry people eat the same way. Quickly, silently, without looking up. Rice turned out to be a farmer. He knew the land, knew when to plant, knew how to water, knew which weeds to pull and which to leave because they scare away pests. Tora knew how to spin, from any fiber, wool, flax, grass. Dan mentally updated the list. A carpenter, a healer, a guard, a farmer, a spinner, a hunter in the form of Anna, an apprentice in the form of Lily, who was learning everything, and him, an engineer. 8 people. The cart creaked that night. Dan approached. On the side of the cart, the circle had changed. 8 dots, 7 along the edges, 1 in the center. But nothing new had appeared in the bed. The module hadn't opened, Dan thought. He counted. The tent after the Taran, the kitchen after Lily, the smithy after Hagen. Mina hadn't given a module. Rice and Tora hadn't given a module. So not everyone he saved unlocks a level. Or maybe it's not about the number but something else. The strength of the bond. The depth of trust. The Taran family were the first. He pulled them out from under a dead horse. Lily came on her own and stayed. Hagen chose his camp. Mina just came. Rice and Tora just showed up too. The difference. He didn't just accept the Tureen, Lily, and Hagen. He did something for them. Personally. Specifically. He fixed the axle. He fed them from his own hands. He made a spear to fit her grip. He gave Mina, Rice, and Tora blood and food. But nothing personal. Nothing specifically for them. Dan wrote down a hypothesis. The cart reacts not to people but to a connection, to an action directed at a specific person, to care that is targeted rather than general. He underlined it. To be tested. Dan tested the hypothesis on the 50th day, not through an experiment, through life. Mina complained about her bag. It was old. It was falling apart at the seams. The little pouches of herbs kept falling out. She would tie the bag up every evening and find a new hole every morning. Dan could have given her some string and told her to fix it herself, but he didn't. He sat down by the fire that evening and began to sew. From a piece of leather cut from the Tureen cart, which had long since been dismantled for parts. He sewed with a multi-tool, an awl on the blade, slowly, hole after hole, stitch after stitch. He didn't know how to sew, but he knew how to think. A herbalist's bag had to be organized, each pouch in its own pocket. Pockets of different sizes because the herbs were different. Large pouches at the bottom, small ones at the top. A flap on top so the rain wouldn't get in. A shoulder strap, not a handle, because her hands were needed for work. He sewed for 3 evenings. His fingers were covered in blisters. The seams were crooked, but the bag turned out fine. He gave it to Mina in the morning. He said the pockets were numbered with notches. 1 for fever reducers, 2 for painkillers, 3 for antiseptics. She could rearrange them as she liked, but there was a system. Mina took the bag, opened it, felt the pockets, counted them. 12 pockets, different sizes, just as she dreamed of, but never asked for, because she thought it was silly to dream of a bag when people were dying all around her. She pressed the bag to her chest. Then she looked at Dan. Then she said quietly that no one had ever made something for her. Just for her. Dan shrugged. He said that a good tool for a healer is lives saved. He hadn't given a gift. He'd made an investment. Mina laughed. For the first time in front of him, a quiet, short laugh, but genuine. At night, the cart creaked. Dan went over. A bundle lay in the bed of the cart. He unwrapped it. Cloth. Thick. White. About 3 meters long. And next to it, a skein of thread. And a bone needle. Thick. Sturdy. Not for sewing clothes. For sewing bandages. And for stitching up wounds. Dan understood. This was Mina's module. Not a smithy. Not a tent. A medical kit. The beginnings of a medical kit. Fabric for bandages. Thread for stitches. A needle. A field medic's basic kit. He took the bundle to Mina. She unfolded the fabric, felt the thread, took the needle. She twirled it between her fingers. Then she looked at Dan and said that now she could stitch up wounds. Before, she could only cauterize. Cauterization leaves scars and kills tissue. A stitch heals cleanly. Dan nodded. Hypothesis confirmed. The cart responds to personalized care, to something made for a specific person. Not to food, not to a roof, to something personal. He wrote it down in his notebook. Confirmed. Then he underlined it and wrote below. Conclusion. Each module corresponds to a person. The tent is a roof for the Terran family. The kitchen is food for hungry Lily. The smithy is weapons and tools for Hajin. The pharmacy is medicine for Mina. The cart doesn't give Dan what he wants. The cart gives what is needed by the one he saved. On the 53rd day, Dan made something for Lily. He had been thinking about it for a long time, ever since the day he saw her with the wooden spoon. The spoon was old. The wood had darkened and cracked in 2 places. It would break soon. But for Lily, that spoon was everything. Her mother's last possession. The only thing from her past life. Like a multi-tool for Dan. Dan couldn't fix the spoon. The wood was too old. But he could make something else. He took a piece of bone. He shaped it on the anvil with a hammer. Slowly, carefully, shaping it. Then he smoothed it with a stone, for hours, until the surface was smooth. He had a handle. Bone, white, smooth. He carved a groove into it, deep and precise, to fit the spoon's shaft. Then he carved letters into the handle, with the multi-tool, Lily, and below, a small drawing, a covered wagon, their wagon. In the evening, he called for Lily. She came over in her 3 steps, with the spoon. Dan showed her the handle. He explained. The spoon fits into the groove. The handle protects the shank from stress. The spoon won't break. It will stay in its new bone mount, and her name is on the mount. Lily took the handle. She looked at the letters, then at the wagon. Then she inserted the spoon into the slot. She stepped forward. It clicked. The spoon in the handle looked like a little scepter, absurd and touching. Lily looked at the spoon for a long time. Then she raised her head. She opened her mouth and spoke. Not a single word, a sentence. She said that this was her spoon and her place and she wasn't going anywhere. Dan crouched down to be at her level. He nodded. He said she wasn't going anywhere. Lily took a step forward. For the first time, she broke her 3-step distance. She moved right up close and hugged him. Thin arms, ribs under his fingers, the smell of smoke and the river. Dan hugged her back, gently, as if she were made of glass. She stood like that for 10 seconds. Then she let go, stepped back, pressed the spoon by the handle against her chest, and she began to speak. From that moment on, Lily talked, a lot, fast, about everything, as if a dam had burst. She told him about her village. It was called Red Meadow, Red Meadows, because in the fall, the grass turned red. 20 families lived there. She had a mother. She didn't remember her father. Her mother sewed and cooked and sang. The spoon was her mother's. Her mother had carved it herself from an apple tree that grew by the house. Then the creatures came, small and many. The village was burning. Her mother told her to run. Lily ran. The neighbors saw her. She knocked on their door. They didn't open it. She ran to the forest. Then she walked alone. She doesn't remember how many days. Then she came out to a stream and sat down. The cart didn't creak that night. Lily's module was already there, the kitchen, hot food for a hungry child. But Dan sensed something else. The cart was warm, warmer than usual, as if content, as if right. On the 55th day, Heijin brought 3 people. She went out on a reconnaissance mission in the morning and returned in the evening with people in tow. 2 men and a woman. The men were brothers, Clem and Bart, peasants from a village that no longer exists. The woman was Inez, a former maid from a wealthy house that had been burned down by looters. All 3 were hungry, dirty, alive. Dan fed them, found them a place to stay. Heijin brought them. Heijin. She didn't just guard the camp. She started patrolling further out, half a day's journey, looking for people. Silently, without orders, without discussion. She just left and came back with whoever she found. Dan looked at her that evening. She was sitting by the barricade, sharpening the tip of a spear. He walked over, sat down beside her, told her she didn't have to. Heijin didn't look up. Said she had to. For 10 years she'd stood on the wall and kept people out. Now she walks outside and brings people home. It's the right thing to do. She paused. Then she added that the spear he'd made for her was the first spear she'd held not to push people away, but to protect them. Dan said nothing. 11 people. The cart on its side showed 11 dots, 10 along the edge, 1 in the center. The camp at the bend in the stream was growing. 2 shelters, a tent, a fire pit, a bean patch, 3 huts, a perimeter system, a barricade, a 3-day supply of dried fish, clay bowls for everyone. It wasn't a camp anymore. It was a settlement. Small, fragile, but alive. Dan stood on the crest of the hill and looked down at the campfire, around which 11 people were sitting. He heard voices, Lily's laughter, Hagen's grumbling, Mina and Tora's quiet conversation, the sound of Thomas's axe somewhere in the grove. He opened his notebook. He wrote, Day 55, population 11. Modules, tent, kitchen, smithy, infirmary. Working hands, 8. Children, 1. Wounded, 0. Food supply, 3 days. Water, yes. Seeds, yes. Tools, multi-tool, hammer, pliers, anvil, axe, spear. No knife, no saw, no shovel. Mood, he thought. He wrote, alive. Dan sewed mine a new bag for herbs, and the cart opened the pharmacy module with bandage cloth and a bone needle. He made an engraved bone handle for Lily's spoon, and the girl began to speak. Hagen started patrolling the area on her own and bringing in refugees. The population grew to 11 people. On the 58th day, a patrol from Greyford arrived. Not 4 like last time, 8. Hagen spotted them first. She ran back from reconnaissance. Her face was stony. She said 8 soldiers, on foot, full gear, chainmail, shields, crossbows, heading from the river straight toward 3 rivers. They know the way. Someone said so. Dan didn't waste time asking who. It didn't matter. What mattered was that 8 armed men would be here in 2 hours. Maybe 3. He had 11 men, 1 fighter, 1 spear, 0 chance in a head-on fight. He gathered everyone. He spoke quickly and calmly. Like at production meetings in his past life when deadlines were missed and they had to decide in 5 minutes who would do what. We're not fighting. We're getting out of here. First, douse the fire. Cover up the fire's traces. Second, camouflage the cart and the awnings. Cover them with branches and sod. Third, everyone heads behind the second stream toward the eastern ravine. There are bushes as tall as a person. We sit quietly. We wait. Fourth, we leave the garden bed. It looks like wild undergrowth if you don't look closely. Pull the tops out of the streams. Remove the bells. Heijin objected. She said that 8 soldiers against a single spear is bad. But if we leave, they'll find the camp and destroy it. They'll lose everything. The supplies, the garden, 2 months' work. Dan replied that a shelter could be rebuilt. A person couldn't be rebuilt. Heijin fell silent. Then she nodded. They worked for an hour, quickly, in silence. Everyone knew what to do because Dan had assigned tasks in a minute. Thomas and Reese were dousing and camouflaging the fire. Anna and Tora were removing the bells and pulled out the tops. Mina gathered the bag and the cloth. Clem and Bart covered the shelters with branches. Inez helped Lily. Hagen stood on the ridge and watched the western approach. Dan was working with the cart. He threw branches onto it. He covered the tarp with a layer of dry grass. From a distance, the cart looked like a pile of brush by the shore. Not perfect. A thorough search would find it, but a cursory glance would miss it. An hour later, the camp looked abandoned. Not empty, abandoned. As if someone had lived there long ago and left. Dan gathered the people. They waded across the second stream. The water was waist deep, cold. Lily was in Dan's arms. Mina carried the bag over her head. They reached the ravine on the eastern slope. The brush was tall and thick. Dan led the people deeper in. He found a small hollow. 11 people lay down in the bushes on the wet ground. Quiet. Dan returned to the edge of the ravine. He lay on his stomach. He watched. Hagen lay down beside him. Her spear lay alongside her body. They waited. An hour later, figures appeared on the crest of the hill to the west. 8 of them, just as Hagen had said. The soldiers were marching in single file, 5 or 6 paces between them. A professional formation for a search. The commander was in front, a cloak over chainmail, a helmet with a visor, a crossbow on his back. They descended to the first stream. They stopped. They looked around. One pointed to the bend in the stream, to the barricade. The commander nodded. 4 went toward the barricade. 4 remained in cover. Dan held his breath. Hagen lay next to him as if dead. Not a sound. Not a movement. The soldiers climbed over the barricade. They entered the bend. Dan watched as they surveyed the area. One kicked a pile of brushwood. A cart. Branches flew in all directions. The tarp was exposed. A soldier called the commander over. The commander approached. He examined the cart, peered into the bed. Empty. Dan had taken everything of value out beforehand. A cauldron, an anvil, a hammer, tongs. They carried everything on their backs. The commander inspected the shelters. He looked inside. He found a sleeping platform, remnants of moss, ash under the stones. He knew people had lived here, but he didn't know where they were now. The soldiers searched the perimeter. They found a vegetable patch. One wanted to pull up the beans. The commander stopped him. He said something Dan didn't catch. Then the soldiers gathered by the debris. The commander spoke. They listened. Dan couldn't make out the words, but he saw the gestures. The commander pointed east, toward the forest, toward the second stream. Then he shook his head, made a gesture with his hand. Stand down, let's go. They left. Not east, west, the way they'd come. Dan lay there and watched them leave, until the last one disappeared over the ridge. Then another 20 minutes. Hagen touched his shoulder, said they were gone. Dan replied that they might have left a lookout. They waited another hour. No one. Dan got up. They returned to camp. The cart stood with its branches stripped off. The canopy was damaged. One post was knocked out. The garden bed was intact. They didn't find the sheaves because Dan had hidden them in the bushes down the stream. Their supplies were with them. Nothing critical was lost. Dan repaired the canopy in a day. The post, the poles, turf, branches back on the cart, bells back in place, the hay bales in the stream. The camp came back to life. But something had changed. People were quieter, more on edge. Lily fell silent again for 2 days. Then she spoke, but less often, quieter. Dan saw fear, not panic, a background constant, people they were being found by and hiding from. Dan gathered everyone in the evening. He said the patrol would return. Not tomorrow, not next week, but it would return. Because they had found the camp, they knew someone lived here, and next time they would come with the intention of staying and waiting. Thomas asked what to do. Dan said they had 2 options. First, leave, abandon 3 Rivers, look for a new place farther from Grayford. Second, stay, but change the camp so that it couldn't be found even if they knew it was here. Hagen asked how. Dan explained. An underground camp, not the whole thing, but the main elements. Dugouts instead of shelters, roofs flush with the ground, covered with sod and grass, the entrance camouflaged. Smoke from the fire is channeled through a long horizontal tunnel so it exits far from the camp and dissipate unnoticed. Paths leading to the camp are laid out over rocks, along a stream, through grass that straightens out. Thomas said it was a massive undertaking, a month's work. Dan replied that they had a month, maybe more. The patrol won't return until it reports to the commander. The commander will report to the Lord. The Lord will decide. That will take time. They'll use it. Construction began. The largest scale project ever. Thomas chopped and hewn. Clem and Bart dug. Rice leveled the ground. Anna and Tora wove walls of twigs to cover the dugout walls. Mina gathered sod. Inez hauled stones for drainage. Lily helped everyone a little. Hagen patrolled and dug when she returned. Dan designed and supervised. Every evening he drew in his notebook. Schematics, calculations. The dugout is 1.5 meters deep, 2 meters wide, 3 meters long. The walls were reinforced with wicker panels and stones. The roof was made of poles covered with sod. The entrance was sloped with a turn so that the light wouldn't be visible from the outside. A drainage ditch around the perimeter so water would flow into the stream. Ventilation through a side channel. He built the dugout just as he had built mobile field hospitals. According to the blueprints, according to the calculations, with a safety margin. The first dugout took 10 days, a large one, for 6 people. When it was ready, Dan brought Lily inside, warm, dry, quiet. The floor was paved with flat stones, the walls were smooth. The ceiling was low but didn't feel oppressive. There was a shelf on the wall. On the shelf was a clay bowl with a name on it. Lily. He had carved the letters into the clay before firing it, for every resident of the camp. Personalized bowls. Lily saw her bowl. She touched the letters. Then she said, "This is mine, for good." Dan said, "For good." Building the underground camp took 6 weeks, not 10 days like the first dugout. 6 weeks because the camp grew faster than Dan could build. During those 6 weeks, 9 more people arrived, in 3 groups. The first group, a man named Alden and his wife Greta, old, over 50, former innkeepers from the town of Dambridge, which had closed its gates a year ago and let no one out. They climbed over the wall at night. Alden broke 3 ribs in the process. Greta carried him on her back for 2 days. Meg directed them to Dan, the second group, 3 people, a young woman named Vera with 2 children, a 5-year-old boy named John, and a 3-year-old girl named Kira. Vera didn't say where they were from. She only said they'd been walking for a long time. The children were quiet, too quiet for their age. John flinched at loud noises. Kira wouldn't let go of her mother for a second. Dan didn't ask. He fed them. He found them a place. The third group, 4 people, 2 teenage brothers, 16 and 14 years old, Evan and Pete, an old man named Horn, a former schoolteacher, and a woman of about 35 named Sarah West. Sarah had brought the other 3. She found them in different places and brought them here. Sarah was different, not like the others, lean, weather-beaten, her face scarred. 2 fingers were missing from her right hand, the ring finger and the little finger. She moved like someone who was used to the road, not tired, not afraid. She just walked and led those who wouldn't have made it on their own. Dan asked where she was from. Sarah said she was from the Eastern League, a former caravan driver. She used to lead trade convoys between cities. The last convoy was 5 months ago. 20 wagons, 40 people, guards, goods. A route through the southern wastes. They didn't make it, not the beasts, their own kind. Slave traders from the League, the very ones who hired the caravan set it up, led it into an ambush, killed the guards. They loaded the people and the goods. Sarah survived because she fell into a ravine when she ran. She fell and lay there for 3 days. Then she got up and walked. 5 months, alone, with 3 fingers on her right hand because 2 were cut off when she tried to hold on to the wagon. She didn't cry as she told the story. Her voice was steady, her eyes were dry. Dan had seen eyes like that before, in people who had cried their hearts out and now just kept going, because to stop meant to die. 20 people. The camp of 11 had grown to 20 in 6 weeks. 4 dugouts, 2 finished, 2 under. The bean patch had tripled in size. Rice had planted a second patch with turnips from seeds Greta had brought. Greta had a little bag of seeds sewn into the lining of her skirt. Turnips, onions, some kind of herb that Mina identified as a painkiller. Greta had carried them from Dambridge as her most precious possession, because she understood what Dan understood. Seeds are the future. When Alden came to after his ribs were set, he proved useful in an unexpected way. He knew recipes, not herbal ones, culinary ones. He had been an innkeeper for 40 years. He knew how to make something out of nothing. From fish and roots, he made a stew that smelled like food, not like boiled water. The difference was enormous. Not in calories, in mood. People who eat tasty food feel like people. People who eat tasteless food feel like they're just surviving. Dan wanted his people to feel like people. Sarah took charge of the route, without being asked, without being assigned. She simply told Dan that she knew the wastelands. She knew the trails. She knows where it's safe and where it isn't. She knows the habits of looters and slave traders. She knows how to read tracks, and that she would lead people from point to point, find supplies, Scout routes. Dan looked at her, asked why. Sarah replied flatly. She said that 40 of her people were dead, that she was the only one who survived, that this wasn't a gift but a debt, and that she would carry this debt until she had atoned for every name. 40 names. Dan was silent. Then he said he understood, but that debt and atonement were different things, and that he didn't want her to go into the wastelands to die for the dead instead of living for the living. Sarah looked at him. For the first time during the entire conversation, something flashed in her eyes. Not anger, not resentment, surprise. She said that no one had ever distinguished between those things when talking to her before. Dan shrugged. He said he was an engineer. He sees the difference between parts that wear out and parts that work as intended. She's wearing out. He needs her to work as intended. For a long time, reliably, without breaking down. Sarah smiled. For the first time, she said he'd compared her to a part of a cart. Dan said that, to him, it was the highest compliment. Sarah smiled even wider. On the 70th day, Dan made something for Sarah. He thought long and hard about what it should be. Then he realized. A knife. Sarah didn't have a knife. The caravan woman who lived by the road didn't have a knife because everything had been taken from her. He could have simply forged a knife and given it to her. But that would have been just a knife. Dan made a knife for her left hand. The handle was wider on the right side and narrower on the left. The blade was angled for a reverse grip. Because Sarah's right hand, missing 2 fingers, couldn't hold a normal knife firmly, she switched it to her left hand. Every knife in the world was for right-handed people. This one was for her. He gave her the knife that evening. Sarah took it, switched it to her left hand, turned it over. The balance was perfect. She looked at the handle, at the angle, at the edge. Then she looked at Dan. She asked quietly, "How does he know she was left-handed from the knife?" Dan said he'd seen her fillet fish, with her left hand, and how she held the bread when she broke it, with her left hand, and how she picked up the flask, with her left hand. Sarah was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said that in 5 months alone in the wastelands, not a single person had noticed that she was missing 2 fingers on her right hand. Because people don't look. But he noticed and made the knife. Dan said it was his job to notice. Sarah tucked the knife into her belt. She stood up. She walked over to the stream. Dan didn't follow her. An hour later she returned. Her eyes were red, but dry. She sat down by the fire and said she would stay. Not out of obligation, out of choice. The wagon creaked in the night. Dan went over. 2 objects lay in the bed. A rolled-up canvas map. Blank. No markings, but with a border and a grid. And a compass. Small. Brass. A working one. The needle pointed north. Sarah's module. Not a weapon. Not a tool. Navigation. A map and compass for a caravan driver who knows the roads. Dan unfolded the map on the ground. Blank. White. Waiting. He took out a notebook. He transferred everything he knew onto the map. The 3 rivers. The camp. Bourne and Meg's huts. Greyford roughly to the west. The forest to the east. The ruins of Anna's and Lily's villages, as described. The patrol route. It turned out to be a small, rough map of a small piece of the world, but the first real map. Sarah came over in the morning. She saw the map. She sat down. She looked at it for a long time. Then she started adding to it. She knew the wastelands. She knew the trails and landmarks and rivers and ravines and ruins. Within an hour, the map had doubled in size. In 2 hours, it tripled in size. By evening, it showed roads and trails and cities and abandoned villages and danger zones and water sources within a 10-day journey from the 3 rivers. Dan looked at the map. For the first time, he saw the world around him not as a fog, but as a space, with points and lines and distances, with routes, with possibilities. 20 people, a map, a compass, 4 dugouts, 2 garden beds, 6 haystacks, a smithy, a pharmacy, a kitchen, a patrol, reconnaissance, camouflage, a week's worth of supplies, a healer, a carpenter, a plowman, a caravan driver, a guard, a spinner, a teacher, a cook. Dan stood over the map in the light of the dying campfire and saw not a camp. He saw a beginning, small, fragile, living, but a beginning. Over 6 weeks of building the underground camp, the population had grown to 20 people, including the caravan driver Sarah West, who had lost her wagon train, and the former innkeepers from Dambridge. Dan forged a left-handed knife for Sarah, and the cart revealed a navigation module with a map and compass. Sarah marked all known trails and landmarks within a 10-day radius on the map. On the 80th day, Dan realized that the camp could no longer be a camp. 20 people ate every day, 20 people drank water, 20 people slept and worked and walked along the trails and left tracks. The camouflage worked. The dugouts were invisible from above. Smoke escaped through a horizontal vent and dissipated in the brush 100 paces from the camp. The trails were changed every 3 days, but 20 people are not 11. Noise, smell, movement, a scale that cannot be completely hidden. Hedgen said that Greyford's patrol hadn't returned. 2 months. That's a long time. Either Lord Holbrook decided that the refugees in the Three Rivers aren't worth his attention, or he's preparing something more serious than a patrol. Dan leaned toward the second option. A man who shoots at the gates doesn't forget about the refugees in the wastes. He's biding his time. Sarah brought news from reconnaissance. She'd gone far. 5 days' journey south. She found 3 dead villages, 1 alive. The living village was called Creek Bend. 20 houses, 100 people, log walls, a stockade, a moat. They were holding on. Barely. The harvest was poor. The beasts were growing in number. Small packs appeared every week, large ones once a month. Creek Bend was surviving but slowly dying, like everyone else. Dan asked Sarah if they were ready for contact. Sarah said their leader, Connor Bale, was a tough man but not a fool. He'd agree to a conversation if he saw a benefit. Dan thought about it for 2 days. Then he made a decision. He would go to Creek Bend, in person. Hedgen said no, categorically. He was the only one holding the camp together. If he were killed or taken prisoner, everything would fall apart. Dan replied that that was exactly why he had to go himself. He couldn't send a messenger. A messenger would tell them about the camp, but he wouldn't show what Dan knew and could do. And Dan needed to sell. He needs to sell an idea. The idea that the nomadic way works, that it's possible to live not behind walls but on wheels. And only he can sell that idea. Hedgen argued for an hour. Then she gave in, but she set a condition. She's going with him. Dan agreed. He left the camp in the care of Sarah and Thomas. Sarah knew the roads, Thomas knew construction, Mina knew medicine, Anna knew hunting, Rice knew the land. The camp would hold out. Dan took 3 things with him: a notebook with a map, a multi-tool, and a small bag of seeds, the last supply, turnips and beans. Hegan took a spear and a knife. Lily stood at the entrance to the dugout and watched them leave. She didn't cry. She said one word: come back. Dan nodded. The journey to Creek Bend took 4 days, across the plain, through an abandoned forest, across a dry riverbed littered with bones. Not human, animal, huge. Hegan said it was a besieger, dead, long dead, a beast the size of a house, ribs like gate arches, a skull like a boulder. Dan stood before the skeleton and thought, if such creatures roam the wastes, then the Creek Bend palisade is a straw wall, and so are his dugouts. Walls don't work, neither big nor small, because a besieger will break through any wall. So the only defense is not to be there when it comes. Movement. Always movement. On the 4th day they saw Creek Bend, a log palisade, a moat, watchtowers at the corners. Men with crossbows stood on the towers. Dan stopped 100 paces away. He raised his hands, empty palms forward. Hedgen stuck her spear into the ground and raised her hands too. A shout came from the tower. Who are you? Dan gave his name. He said he had come with a proposal for the chief. The gate did not open. 10 minutes later, a man climbed onto the wall, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, a face like a block of stone. Connor Bale. He looked down at Dan. He asked what the proposal was. Dan said he would show it, not tell it. He asked him to come in. Bale thought for a minute. Then he ordered the gate to be opened. Dan entered Creek Bend and saw what he had expected. Hunger. Not as acute as in the early days of his camp, but chronic, lingering. Children with big bellies and thin arms. Adults with gray faces. The vegetable gardens were sparse. There was only one well. A line stretched from morning to night. The roofs had been patched 10 times. The walls were propped up from the inside with logs. Everything was on the brink. He asked Bale for 2 hours. Bale granted them. Dan walked around the village. He looked. He counted. He took notes. After 2 hours, he returned to Bale. He sat down across from him at his house, and he began to speak. He said that the Creek Bend well was poisoned. Not with poison, just stagnant water. It doesn't circulate. Half the illnesses in the village come from the water. A sand filter will solve the problem in a day. He showed how. He drew it in his notebook. He said that the vegetable gardens in the shade of the palisade only get sun for half the day. They need to be moved to the south side, or cut down the 3 trees that cast the shade. The trees can be used for firewood, 2 birds with 1 stone. I said the ditch around the village is silted up, the water's stagnant, mosquitoes, diseases. If we dig a drain to the stream, the ditch will become a flowing one. Mosquitoes don't breed in flowing water. Bale listened in silence. His face didn't change. When Dan finished, Bale asked who he was. Dan replied, "An engineer, a man who makes things work." Bale asked what he wanted. Dan took out a small bag of seeds. He placed it on the table. He said, "I'm giving you these seeds. I'll build a filter. I'll show you how to clean the ditch. In return, I need one thing. If my caravan passes by Creek Bend, we can trade. Fish and pottery from us, grain and timber from you. And if people come to you with nowhere to go, send them to the 3 rivers." Bale looked at the little bag, then at Dan. Then he asked what a caravan was. Dan explained. Not a camp, not a village, not a town. A mobile settlement. People on wheels, who don't stay in one place because staying in one place means dying. Bale was silent for a long time. Then he said it was madness. Dan said it might be. But his madness feeds 20 people in the wall-less wastes. And the walls of Creek Bend feed 100 people, and every year there are 10 fewer. Bale clenched his jaw. Then he held out his hand. They shook hands. Dan built a filter in half a day, showed him how to clean the ditch. He pointed out which trees to cut down. He left the seeds behind. Bale stood at the gate as Dan left. He said that if a caravan passed by, the gate would be open. Dan nodded and walked away. 4 days back. Hajin walked silently beside him. On the 3rd day, she said that in the guard, they taught her one thing. That strength is walls and swords. That without walls, a person is nothing. That open space is death. Then she paused and added that Dan had just taken a village of 100 people with a sack of seeds and sand. Without a sword, without a wall, without a single blow. Dan replied that he hadn't taken the village. He'd found a neighbor. Hejin shook her head. She said it was the same thing. He just didn't understand it yet. Dan returned to camp on the 88th day and found 26 people instead of 20. While he was gone, 6 more had arrived. 3 from some village in the east, a woman with a child from the forest, and a girl on her own, young, thin. Her hands were covered in burns and blisters up to her elbows. Her name was Jaewon Ryu. Jay. She was 19 years old. Sarah found her in a pit, literally. Looters had robbed her and thrown her into a garbage ravine near the ruined city. She had lain there for 2 days. Sarah pulled her out, brought her to the camp. Mina treated her wounds. Jay came to on the 3rd day, and the first thing she asked was if there was a forge in the camp. Dan walked over to her. He asked why she needed a forge. Jay said she was a blacksmith, an apprentice. 3 years with a master in the city of Vale Hammer, the best weapons city on the continent. It used to be the best, before the plague wiped out half the population and the walls couldn't hold. She fled. The master didn't flee. He stayed by the forge. He said a blacksmith doesn't abandon the forge. Jay didn't know if he had died. Dan looked at her hands. Burns from the forge. Calluses from the hammer. These hands knew metal. Not like Dan, who pounded the anvil and hoped for the best. For real. He said there was no forge. There was an anvil and a hammer and a fire. Jay looked at the anvil. A small one. She touched it. Said it would be enough to start with. You could stoke the fire with bellows to melting temperature if you knew how. And she knew. Dan asked what she needed. Jay said bellows. Clay for the furnace. Coal, not firewood. And metal. Any kind. Rusty, broken, whatever. Dan sent Clem and Bart to the 3rd stream for clay. Thomas went for coal. In the forest to the east, there were charred tree trunks left over from an old fire. Thomas hauled back 3 sacks of coal in 2 days. Jay made the bellows herself, out of leather, 2 small boards, and a piece of tubing carved from a hollow stalk. Primitive, but it worked. She pumped the bellows and the flames in the fire shot up. White, fierce, hot. Dan recoiled. Jay didn't recoil. She stood before the fire and her eyes burned brighter than the flames. She was home. In the first week, Jay had remade everything. She remelted Dan's nails and reforged them. Even, identical, professional. She sharpened Hagen's axe and reattached it to a new handle. Knives. She forged 4 knives in 3 days from the rusty scraps Sarah had dragged back from the dead villages. Not masterpieces, utility blades. Sharp, reliable. But the most important thing she made on the 10th day, arrowheads. 20 of them. Small, triangular, razor sharp. Hagen took one, turned it over in her hand, whistled. She said she'd only seen arrowheads like these on Greyford's elite guard. Jay shrugged and said the master taught her to do it right, or not at all. Dan watched Jay by the forge and thought, she's 19. She lost her home and her teacher and her city. She was thrown into a pit, and here she stands, forging. Because forging is all she has, and all she needs. In the evening, he walked over to her. She was stoking the forge. Her face was covered in soot. Her hands were black. Her eyes were tired but alive. He took an object out of his pocket. Small, iron, a key, a real key. He had forged it himself, secretly, at night, while everyone was asleep. Crooked, of course, but recognizable. A key to the smithy. Symbolic, because the smithy had no door, but there was a key. He handed it to Jay, said the smithy was hers. He wasn't a blacksmith. She was the blacksmith. The forge was hers, her anvil, her metal. She decides what to forge, when, and how. Jay took the key, looked at it, turned it over in her fingers, then pressed it to her chest with both hands. Then she looked up. Her eyes were wet. She said quietly that her master had never given her a key, in 3 years. He said a woman at the forge was a disgrace, that she was an apprentice and would remain an apprentice, that the forge wasn't for her. Dan said the master was wrong. Jay nodded. Then she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and smeared soot across her face. She laughed. Then she said she'd forge him a knife, the best knife she'd ever make. The cart creaked. Dan was used to it by now. He walked over. This time, the module was different. There weren't tools in the bed. There were blueprints, rolled up into a tube, thin leather with lines drawn on it. Dan unrolled it and froze. These were blueprints, real engineering blueprints. A diagram of a wheeled frame, reinforced, with bent wood springs, with a swivel mechanism on the front axle, with mounts for modular sections on the sides, with connectors for linking several frames in a chain. This wasn't a sketch of a cart, it was a sketch of a mobile home, on wheels, with the ability to connect to others just like it. Dan sat over the drawings, his hands trembling. He recognized the handwriting, not his own, but an engineer's. The lines were crisp, the scale was accurate. Material designations, tolerances, dimensions. Someone had drawn this before him, someone who knew engineering, not medieval, modern. In the corner of the drawing was a signature, a V. Alden Warren. Dan ran his finger over the letters. 120 years ago, a man named Alden Warren had drawn these blueprints and hidden them in a cart. He waited, waiting for someone who would understand. On the 95th day, Dan began building from the drawings, not alone, with Jay, Thomas, and Clem. The frame, the axles, the wheels, based on Warren's drawings with Dan's modifications. Because the drawings were perfect, but the materials weren't. Dan adapted. He replaced steel with wood where steel was impossible. He replaced bolts with pins and wedges. He traded machine precision for the precision of the eye and hand, but he kept the principle: modularity, coupling, mobility. 2 weeks later, they had a second frame, more than a cart, on 4 wheels, with a platform on which to place a dugout, a mobile one. Dan placed the first living section on the frame, walls made of woven panels, a roof of sod on poles, a door that closes, a window, small, but a window. Inside, a cot, a shelf, and a place for a fire with a chimney. He rolled the frame up to the cart, coupled them. Vaughn's blueprint called for a coupling, a simple one, a hook and a loop. Dan made a J-hook out of wrought iron. The cart and the frame were joined. Then Dan harnessed himself to the shaft. He pulled. It was heavy, very hard, but it started moving, both of them, together, the cart and the living module. 26 people stood and watched, quietly. Then Lily clapped her hands, then the rest. Dan stopped, turned around, looked at his people, and said they needed a horse. Everyone laughed. It was a good day. 19-year-old blacksmith Jay Ryu joined the camp and set up a proper production of weapons and tools. Dan handed her the key to the smithy, and the wagon revealed Alden Warren's blueprints for a modular mobile home. Dan built the first wheeled living section and attached it to the cart. Sarah found the horse. Not just one, 3, feral ones. In an abandoned corral at a dead farm 2 days' journey to the east. How they survived was a mystery. There was water. Grass grew through holes in the fence. There aren't many animals in that area. They were lucky. Sarah led them on ropes, skinny, skittish, but alive. Rice knew horses. Farm horses were part of his former life. He took care of them, fed them, watered them, groomed them. He talked to them. A week later, the biggest one let him harness her to the cart. Dan stood nearby and watched as Rice led the horse to the shaft. The horse glanced sideways. She snorted, but she stood still. Rice secured the harness. Dan clicked his tongue. The horse started moving. The wagon and the living quarters rolled away, smoothly, easily, as if that was how it was meant to be. The 100th day. 3 months and 10 days since Dan had lain on the dusty road before the walls of Greyford. 28 people. A wagon with 3 modules hitched to it. A living quarters section, a kitchen section, a smithy section, 3 horses, an underground camp in the 3 rivers, a trade agreement with Creek Bend, a map for a 10-day journey, an arsenal consisting of 2 spears, 12 knives, and 100 arrowheads, garden beds with beans, turnips, and onions, 6 horses, a first aid kit with bandages and herbs, personal bowls for everyone, and Alden Warren's blueprints, which Dan studied every night by the light of the campfire. The blueprints told a story, not with words, with lines. Warren wasn't designing a wagon, he was designing a city, a mobile one, a modular one. Frames connect to form a line. The line curves into a ring. The ring closes. A circle is formed. Inside the circle is a square. Around the circle are walls made of the living modules themselves. The wheels become the foundation. The platforms become the walls. The roofs become towers. A mobile city that turns into a fortress in an hour and becomes a caravan again in another hour. Dan looked at the blueprints and saw the future. Not his own, a shared one. If 10 such frames were built and connected, if 20, if 50, a city on wheels, one that never stands still, one that goes where it's needed and leaves when it's dangerous, one that doesn't wait behind walls until the beast comes and breaks through, one that leaves before the beast reaches it. On the 105th day, Emma Rose Hallbrook arrived. She didn't come. She crawled. Hagen found her half a kilometer from the camp. She was lying in the grass. Her dress was torn. Her face was covered in mud. Her light hair was gray with dust. Her thin fingers were scraped. No shoes, no belongings. Nothing. Hagen carried her in her arms. Mina examined her. Dehydration, starvation, abrasions. Feet rubbed raw and bleeding. Nothing life-threatening, but close. They gave her water, fed her, laid her down. She came to a day later. Dan was sitting beside her when she opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling of the dugout, at the walls, at the shelf, at the clay bowl with no name because no one knew her name. Then she looked at Dan. She said her name was Emma Rose. Dan asked where she was from. She paused. Then she said, Greyford. Dan didn't move. She continued. She said she was Lord Hallbrook, that the Lord was selling her into a political marriage to Lord Dambridge, that she had escaped at night over the same wall that Alden and Greta had climbed, that the guards had fired shots after her, that she had been running for 2 days, without food, without water, without a plan, because anything is better than being a thing passed from hand to hand. Dan listened. Then he said that here she wasn't an object. Here she was a person, and if she wanted to stay, she would stay. Emma Rose looked at him. There was distrust in her eyes, familiar, deep-seated. The eyes of a person who had been lied to her whole life. Dan didn't try to convince her. He just stood up and left. Because words are worth nothing. Actions are worth something. A week later, Emma Rose was back on her feet. She was weak. She didn't know how to build a fire. She didn't know how to cook. She didn't know how to set snares. She didn't know how to do anything needed in the wastelands. But she knew other things. She knew 6 languages. She could read and write in all 6. She could count, quickly, accurately, in her head. Dan noticed this when, in 10 seconds, she calculated how many fish were needed for 28 people at 3 fish per serving. 84. He looked at her. Then he gave her a task, to keep the caravan's ledgers, to record everything. How much food came in and went out, how much water, how much firewood, how many nails and knives and arrowheads, who was healthy, who was sick, who was doing what every day. Emma Rose got to work. A month later, she came to Dan with a report, written in neat, even hand on birch bark because there was no paper. She had found a problem. Salt was being overused. They were using salt to cure fish, but the per-person allowance was too high. If they cut it by a quarter, the supply would last until spring. If they didn't cut it, it would run out in 6 weeks. Dan read the report. He looked at Emma Rose. She stood straight, hands behind her back, chin slightly raised, an aristocrat's habit. But her eyes were different. Not cold, waiting for an assessment, not praise, an assessment. Because her whole life she'd been valued for her face, her surname, and her political clout. but never once for her work. Dan said she'd saved their winter, that without her calculations, they'd have run out of salt in January, that she'd done it, not him, her. Emma Rose stood there, then her lips twitched. She turned away. Dan could hear her breathing, fast, ragged. Then she turned back. Her eyes were wet, but a smile, her first real one. She said quietly that her uncle didn't remember her name correctly. He confused her with her cousin. 24 years. Dan wrote it down on her clay bowl. Emma Rose, full name, no abbreviations. Winter came on the 120th day. Not a mild one, a real one. The north wind carried icy sleet. The streams were covered with a crust of ice along the banks. The grass withered and lay flat. The temperature dropped every day. Dan was getting ready. For 3 weeks, that was all he did, get ready. He insulated the dugouts, double walls with an air gap. A simple principle. The air between the walls doesn't let the cold through. It works like a thermos. Heijin listened to his explanation and asked what a thermos was. Dan said it was a container for hot things. Heijin said it was called a pot. Dan said no. A thermos is a pot inside a pot with air between them. Heijin looked at him and said he was obsessed with pots. Dan said the pots would save her life in the winter. Heijin snorted and went to insulate the walls. Firewood. Thomas chopped down trees from morning till night. Clem and Bart hauled them away. Rice split them. The stockpile grew. Stacks along the walls of the dugouts. Food. The garden beds yielded their last harvest before the frosts. Turnips, beans, onions. Not much. Enough for a month if they were frugal. Fish. The Verchies worked until the streams froze over. Dan salted and dried every catch. According to Emma Rose's standards, not a gram to spare. Meat. Over the fall, Anna had become a real hunter. Not for groundhogs, for larger game, something like the wild goats that roamed the eastern forest. She bagged 1 or 2 a week. They smoked the meat in the chimney of the blacksmith section. Jay figured out how to combine the forge and the smokehouse. The heat from the forging went through a channel where the pieces of meat hung. Double use of a single fire. Dan would have hugged her for that idea if she hadn't been standing by the red-hot forge. Instead, he said she was a genius. Jay blushed beneath a layer of soot and said she wasn't a genius, just a blacksmith. Dan replied that, as far as he was concerned, they were synonyms. Jay laughed and nearly dropped the tongs into the fire. On the 130th day, the first real frost hit. Below zero. Dan didn't know by how much. There was no thermometer, but the water had frozen in the bowls overnight. Breath turned to steam. The ground was like stone. The morning of the first frost, Dan stepped out of the dugout and saw a white world. Frost on everything. On the grass, on the bushes, on the cart, on the tarp, on the shelters. Beautiful and deadly. He checked the dugouts, all 4. The double walls held. It wasn't warm inside, but it wasn't freezing either. The people had woken up, alive, functional. He checked the supplies. There was firewood, there was food, water from the stream. The stream hadn't frozen to the bottom. The middle was flowing. It was awkward to draw water, but possible. He checked on the horses. Riss had built a shelter for them on the leeward side. Hay was stockpiled. The horses were freezing but standing. He checked the wagon. It was warm, as always, even in the frost. The wagon felt warm to the touch, as if alive. The first week of winter was hard, not physically, mentally. 30 people, including 2 children who had arrived last, sat in dugouts and waited. Waiting in the dark and cold is the hardest thing there is. Harder than hunger, harder than the beasts. Because hunger and the beasts are action, but waiting is emptiness. Dan saw the mood dropping, how people quarreled over trifles, how Clem and Bart nearly came to blows over a spot by the fire, how Vera cried every night while little John stayed awake, sitting at the entrance to the dugout with his eyes open. He decided to act. On the 135th day, the end of the first week of winter, he hadn't slept all night. He'd been working, quietly, in the blacksmith section, by the light of the forge, cutting, planing, measuring, calculating. In the morning, he went out to the people. It was still dark. He woke everyone up, every single one by one, quietly. He told them to go to the cart. 30 people emerged from the dugouts into the darkness. Frost, steam from their mouths, stars overhead. A table stood by the cart, a long one, a folding table. Dan had put it together from poles and planks during the night. 6 candles burned on the table. Not real ones, wicks made of twisted hair and clay pots filled with fish oil, but they were burning. 6 little flames in the darkness. There was food on the table. Hot bread, real bread. Alden had baked it the night before at Dan's secret request, using the last of the flour Greta had brought from Dambridge. Baked turnips, braised goat meat, A cup of herbal tea for everyone. Hot. At each place setting on the table stood a wooden plaque, with a name, carved by Dan himself. 30 nameplates, 30 names, in a single night. Lily, Anna, Thomas, Hedgen, Mina, Sarah, Jay, Emma Rose, Rice, Thora, Alden, Greta, Vera, John, Kira, Clem, Bart, Inez, Horn, Evan, Pete, and everyone else. Every single name. People approached the table, found their sign, looked at it. Lily found hers first, picked it up, read. She looked at Dan. She asked quietly, "Is this my seat?" "For good?" Dan said. "For good." Lily sat down. Then Anna sat down. Then Hedgen. Hedgen looked at the nameplate and laid her spear on the ground. She just laid it down, next to her, not in her hands. Sarah took her nameplate. She read it. Then she looked down the table. 30 seats, 30 names. Her eyes welled up. She smiled, without sarcasm, without bitterness. She just smiled. For the first time in over 2 years, Emma Rose found her nameplate. Full name, no abbreviations. She said quietly that her uncle had never remembered her name correctly. Jan, a little boy who was afraid of everything, found his nameplate and pressed it to his chest. Then he sat down and didn't let go of it the whole meal. 30 people sat at a long table on a frosty morning under unfamiliar stars. They ate hot bread, they drank hot broth, and they understood. Not with their minds, deeper, that they were home, that they had a place, that their names were carved into the wood, that someone had stayed up all night to make a nameplate for each of them, that this meant they weren't mouths, not a burden, not a burden. They are people, who have a chair at the table and a name on a plaque. Dan stood at the end of the table and looked at them, 30 faces in the light of 6 small fires. Then Lily stood up. She walked over to him, took his hand, pulled him. She said, "Dad, sit down. Your seat is right here." She pointed to the nameplate at the end of the table. Dan. Just Dan. He had written all 30 names, but he'd forgotten his own. Lily carved it out herself, with a multi-tool, crooked. The letters dance, but legible. Dan sat down, and for the first time in 135 days, he didn't know what to say. He just sat there, with tears in his eyes, at his table, among his people. Winter dragged on. It was hard, but they ate, they slept, they worked, they didn't die. Dan heard from Sarah that the town of Dambridge had lost a third of its population to the plague that winter, that the village south of Greyford had surrendered to the beasts, that the Eastern League's caravans weren't running, that the roads were dead. The world around them was freezing and dying, and 30 people lived in dugouts at 3 Rivers, because they had hot bread and name tags and a man who stayed awake at night to keep them warm. Spring came on the 171st day. The ice on the streams cracked and melted away. The ground thawed. The first green shoots pierced the brown grass. The air smelled of water and life. Dan stood on the crest of the hill and looked at the world waking up. Behind him, the camp was buzzing. 35 people. 5 more had arrived over the winter, because the word had spread, quietly, across the wastelands. From Bourne to the traveler, from the traveler to the village, from the village to the refugee. Somewhere in the 3 Rivers there is a man, with a cart, who doesn't close the gate. Dan went down to the camp. Sarah was waiting for him with news, bad news. She had gone on a reconnaissance mission to Greyford, not close, a day's journey away, and she saw an army. 300. Not a patrol, a force, infantry, crossbowmen, cavalry. Banners of 3 cities, Greyford, Dambridge, and a 3rd city that Sarah didn't recognize. At the head of the column rode a man in a black cloak, tall, lean. Sarah described him. Hedgen turned pale. She said she knew who it was, Kalen Morse, inquisitor of the Sten Doctrine, supreme enforcer, the man who ensures that no one violates the continent's primary law, the law that states that people live within the walls, only within the walls. Any settlement outside the walls must be destroyed or brought back under the city's authority. Nomadic travel is forbidden, caravans are forbidden. Anything that moves and lives outside the walls is forbidden. Dan asked how long it would take. Sarah said 3 days, maybe 4. It depends on the speed of the march. Dan closed his eyes. 3 days, 300 soldiers, 35 people in the camp, of whom 1 is a fighter. Well, 2 if you count Sarah. Well, 3 if you count Anna with her bow, against 300. He could run, break camp, saddle the horses, head east, into the forest, deep into the wastelands. 300 soldiers wouldn't go deep in, too dangerous, the beasts. He could run and start over, further, deeper, safer. He thought for 2 hours, sat in the dugout and thought. Then he went out, gathered everyone, told the truth. The army is coming. 300, the Inquisitor. They'll be here in 3 days. We have a choice. Run or stay. Silence. Then Hedgen said, if we run, they'll come back. They'll find us. They always do. Because we leave traces. Because people talk. Because we're growing. And the more of us there are, the more visible we are. Running is a delay, not a solution. Dan nodded. He knew. Then Sarah said, if we fight, we'll die. All of us. And the children too. 30 against 300 isn't a fight. It's an execution. Dan nodded. He knew that too. Then Lily said, what if we just talk? 35 people looked at the 11-year-old girl with a wooden spoon and a bone handle. Dan looked at her and realized she was right. For 2 days he had been preparing. Not for battle, not for flight, for a meeting. He ordered the cart to be raised into what Warren's blueprints called a battle configuration. The modules on the hitch lined up in a row. Jay fired the bellows at full power and heated the projectiles. Fist-sized chunks of iron. Not for shooting, for show. So the army would see that the camp was armed. Hedgen raised her spear on a makeshift tower of poles. Mina hung small bags of burning powder from ropes, red pepper and some kind of herb that stung the eyes. Not weapons, deterrence. Anna stood with her bow on the flank. 30 arrows with D-tipped, 30 against 300. Ridiculous. But it looked impressive, because Dan had arranged everything to look that way. The tower, the horn, the red-hot projectiles, the arsenal in plain sight. People in formation, not soldiers, but people standing upright and not running away. Then he gave a second order, not a combat order, the opposite. He told everyone to sit down, sit on the ground, in front of the cart, in a line, adults and children, all 35 of them, facing west, where the army would come from. Hajin objected. She said it was madness, that they couldn't sit in front of a formation of 300. Dan said that was exactly what he was asking, to sit down, to show their faces, to show that they were people, not enemies, to show that they weren't running or fighting, just sitting, just living, and waiting. Hajin argued for 10 minutes, then she fell silent. Then she stuck her spear into the ground beside her and sat down. On the 173rd day, the army came. Dan saw them from the crest of the hill, a line, wide, dark, the glint of iron, the thud of footsteps. 300 men were marching through the valley toward the 3 rivers. At the front, on horseback, a man in black, Kellen Morse. Even from a distance, Dan could see him, tall, upright, like a spear stuck in a saddle. The army approached to within 200 paces. It stopped. Morse dismounted. He surveyed the camp. The wagon in battle configuration, the tower, the horn, men sitting in a line on the ground, and one man standing before them. Dan stood alone, unarmed, his hands empty, palms open. Between him and 300 soldiers lay 100 paces of wet spring grass. Morse was walking toward him, alone, no entourage, steady stride, a cloak on his back, gray eyes, quiet. The eyes of a man who had seen many deaths and was weary of each one. He stopped 5 paces from Dan, looked at him, then at the people behind him, then back at him. Spoke in a quiet, even voice. What have you done? Not a question, a statement of fact. Dan answered calmly. He said he had gathered people cast out by the cities, fed them, gave them shelter, gave them a name. Morse was silent for 3 seconds. Then he said that Dan had violated the doctrine of the walls, that a settlement outside the walls was illegal, that the caravan was illegal, that Dan was a heretic who was undermining the very foundations of humanity's existence. Dan replied quietly. He said that the walls of Greyford had thrown him out onto the road with a note. The city doesn't feed extra mouths. The walls of Greyford didn't let the Terran family in. The walls of Greyford shot at children at the gates. The walls of Dambridge locked people inside with the plague. Walls do not save. Walls take away. Morse stood and listened. His face did not change, but something in his eyes flinched, a small thing, like a crack in stone. Dan spoke. Kalen. There are 35 people here whom your cities have cast out. Go and look them in the face, one by one, call each by name. If after that you give the order, we will not resist. Morse stood. He looked at Dan. Then he turned to the row of seated people, and he walked, slowly, along the line. First, Thomas Terran, lame, sitting upright. looking up at Morse, not looking away. Second, Anna, 14 years old, bow on her back, hands on her knees, face calm. Third, Hejin So, spear stuck in the ground nearby, scar across her eyebrow, eyes locked with Morse's. She said evenly, "I am a former lieutenant in your guard. I was expelled for refusing to shoot people." Morse did not reply. He walked on. Mina, small, round-faced, a bag on her lap. Sarah, veiny, 3 fingers on her right hand, dry eyes, a knife at her belt, left-handed. Jay, hands with burns, soot under her fingernails, a key to the smithy on a string around her neck. Emma Rose, Lord Holbrook's niece, blonde hair, slender fingers, a birch bark ledger on her lap. She looked at Morse and said quietly, "My uncle sold me into marriage like a cow. This man gave me a name and a job." Morse moved on. Alden and Greta, old, sitting side by side, holding hands. Vera with John on her lap. The boy looked at Morse and didn't flinch, for the first time. Clem, Bart, Rice, Thora, Inez, Horn, Evan, Pete. 34 faces, and the 35th, the last in the row. Lily, little, redhead, freckles, a wooden spoon with a bone handle pressed to her chest. Green eyes looking up at the tall man in the black coat. She said, "My name is Lily. Lily Tarvin. You remembered." Morse stood. He looked at her. 10 seconds, 20, 30. His face didn't change, but his hands. Dan saw it. Morse's hands clenched into fists. Then they opened. Then they clenched again. He stood before an 11-year-old girl with a spoon and couldn't move. Because he, too, had had a daughter. Once upon a time. Before the tide, before the walls, before the doctrine. He had had a daughter, and he had built walls to protect her. And the walls hadn't saved her. Dan didn't know that, but he could tell. By the way Morse looked at Lily, by the way his fists clenched and unclenched, by the way something was breaking inside him. Quietly, soundlessly, like ice under the spring sun. Morse reached the end of the line. He stood there, turned around, walked back to his soldiers. 300 stood and waited. Morse stood before the formation. He was silent for a minute. Dan stood and watched. 35 men behind him sat and watched. Silence. Only the stream, only the wind. Morse uttered a single word, quietly, but in the silence everyone heard him. Dismissed. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode off, without looking back. The army stood for another 30 seconds, then began to turn around. Slowly, like a large animal that had changed its mind. They were leaving, 300 of them, leaving. Dan stood and watched. His legs wouldn't hold him, but he stood. The next morning, Hejin woke him up, quietly. She told him to come out. Dan stepped out of the dugout. People were standing at the perimeter line, not his men, strangers, in chainmail, unarmed. Their weapons were laid out on the ground in front of them. Swords, crossbows, shields, in a neat pile. 18 men, Morse's soldiers. Dan approached. One of them stepped forward, young, blonde-haired. He said they were staying, that the Inquisitor had left but they hadn't, that they had seen faces, that they had seen nameplates, that they wanted a seat at the table. Dan looked at them. 18 soldiers, who had laid down their weapons and come, because they had seen that there was more than just death beyond the walls. Behind him, the cart creaked, loudly, louder than ever. Dan turned around. The cart was changing. The sides of the body were sliding apart, up into the sides. Shapes were growing out of the wood and metal, hinges, frames, doors. Dan watched and couldn't move. A gate grew out of the sides of the cart, a real one, wooden with metal fittings, double-leafed, as tall as 2 men, with hinges, with a bolt, with a threshold. The gate stood in an open field, attached to nothing, protecting nothing. Just gates, just a door. But Dan understood. This wasn't protection. It was a symbol. It was an invitation. Gates that don't close. Gates that are always open. Because a real home isn't locked away from the world. A real home is open. 53 people stood around the cart with the gate, old and new. His people and the soldiers who had just become his people. Dan stood in front of the gate. He looked at it. Wooden panels, metal hinges. Work he hadn't done. Work the cart had done. Work the trust of 53 people had done. He didn't know what to say. He didn't need to say anything. Lily walked over. She took his hand, a small palm in a large one, a spoon in the handle pressed to her chest with her other hand. She looked at the gate, then at him, and said quietly, "Dad, we have a door now." Dan stood there, 53 people behind him, the gate before his eyes, the spring sky above his head, a foreign sky that, in 173 days, had become his own. He cried, silently, not from grief, not from fear, not from exhaustion, from the fact that the dead engineer from Ohio, who in the last second of his life had been thinking about the unfinished mobile pharmacy, was standing in the middle of a foreign world before the gate that the cart had grown into. And beyond that gate were no walls. Beyond that gate was a road, long, endless, open. Lily squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Then he wiped his face. He turned to his people. 53 faces, old and young, lame and healthy, three-toed and whole, with scars and without. Soldiers and peasants and blacksmiths and healers and children, his people. He said one word. Let's go. Rice harnessed the horses. The cart set off. The modules on the hitches rolled after it. The gate followed last, open. 53 people walked alongside, on foot, on carts, on horses, each as best they could. They were heading south, toward Creek Bend, toward their first ally, toward the first stop on a route that didn't exist yet, but that would. Dan walked beside the wagon, in one hand, Lily's hand, in the other, a notebook. He was already drawing. The route, a loop, 3 rivers, Creek Bend, further south, then east, then north, then back, a loop, a 6-month journey, with stops, with trade, with new people, with secret warehouses, with alliances, with those villages that are still holding on and that need not a lord, but a neighbor. The Longhouse. It didn't have a name yet, but it would come, later, when the caravan grew, when 100 people became 200, when the living quarters stretched out into a long snake on wheels, and someone would say that it looks like a home, a long home on wheels, that never stands still, that never closes its gates, that moves, always moves, because a home isn't walls, a home is people and a roof over them, even if the roof is on wheels. Dan walked. Lily walked beside him. The wagon rolled ahead, warm, alive, content. The road stretched off into the horizon, and they walked along it, together.